Kings of the Night. By Robert E. Howard. First published in Weird Tales, November 1930. Chapter 1. The Caesar lolled on his ivory throne, his iron legions came to break a king in a land unknown, and a race without a name. The Song of Bran. The dagger flashed downward. A sharp cry broke in a gasp. The form on the rough altar twitched convulsively and lay still. The jagged flint edge sawed at the crimson breast, and thin bony fingers, ghastly dyed, tore out the still twitching heart. Under matted white brows, sharp eyes gleamed with a ferocious intensity. Besides the slayer, 4 men stood about the crude pile of stones that formed the altar of the god of shadows. One was of medium height, lithely built, scantily clad, whose black hair was confined by a narrow iron band in the center of which gleamed a single red jewel. Of the others, 2 were dark like the first. But where he was lithe, they were stocky and misshapen, with knotted limbs, and tangled hair falling over sloping brows. His face denoted intelligence and implacable will. There's merely a beast-like ferocity. The 4th man had little in common with the rest. Nearly a head taller, though his hair was black as theirs, his skin was comparatively light, and he was gray-eyed. He eyed the proceedings with little favor. And, in truth, Cormac of Connaught was little at ease. The druids of his own Isle of Arran had strange dark rites of worship, but nothing like this. Dark trees shut in this grim scene, lit by a single torch. Through the branches moaned an eerie night wind. Cormac was alone among men of a strange race, and he had just seen the heart of a man ripped from his still pulsing body. Now the ancient priest, who looked scarcely human, was glaring at the throbbing thing. Cormac shuddered, glancing at him who wore the jewel. Did Bran Mac Morn, king of the Picts, believe that this white-bearded old butcher could foretell events by scanning a bleeding human heart? The dark eyes of the king were inscrutable. There were strange depths to the man that Cormac could not fathom, nor any other man. "The portents are good!" exclaimed the priest wildly, speaking more to the 2 chieftains than to Bran. "Here from the pulsing heart of a captive Roman I read, defeat for the arms of Rome! Triumph for the sons of the heather!" The 2 savages murmured beneath their breath, their fierce eyes smoldering. "Go and prepare your clans for battle," said the king, and they lumbered away with the ape-like gait assumed by such stunted giants. Paying no more heed to the priest who was examining the ghastly ruin on the altar, Bran beckoned to Cormac. The Gael followed him with alacrity. Once out of that grim grove, under the starlight, he breathed more freely. They stood on an eminence, looking out over long swelling undulations of gently waving heather. Near at hand a few fires twinkled, their fewness giving scant evidence of the hordes of tribesmen who lay close by. Beyond these were more fires, and beyond these still more, which last marked the camp of Cormac's own men, hard-riding, hard-fighting Gaels, who were of that band which was just beginning to get a foothold on the western coast of Caledonia, the nucleus of what was later to become the kingdom of Dalriadia. To the left of these, other fires gleamed. And far away to the south were more fires, mere pinpoints of light. But even at that distance the Pictish king and his Celtic ally could see that these fires were laid out in regular order. "The fires of the legions," muttered Bran. "The fires that have lit a path around the world. The men who light those fires have trampled the races under their iron heels. And now, we of the heather have our backs at the wall. What will fall on the morrow?" "Victory for us," says the priest, answered Cormac. Bran made an impatient gesture. "Moonlight on the ocean. Wind in the fir tops. Do you think that I put faith in such mummery? Or that I enjoyed the butchery of a captive legionary? I must hearten my people. It was for Gran and Boca that I let old Gunnar read the portents. The warriors will fight better." "And Gunnar?" Bran laughed. "Gunnar is too old to believe anything. He was high priest of the shadows a score of years before I was born. He claims direct descent from that Gunnar who was a wizard in the days of Brule the Spear Slayer, who was the first of my line. No man knows how old he is. Sometimes I think he is the original Gunnar himself. At least, said a mocking voice, and Cormac started as a dim shape appeared at his side. At least I have learned that in order to keep the faith and trust of the people, a wise man must appear to be a fool. I know secrets that would blast even your brain, Bran, should I speak them. But in order that the people may believe in me, I must descend to such things as they think proper magic, and prance and yell and rattle snakeskins, and dabble about in human blood and chicken livers. Cormac looked at the ancient with new interest. The semi-madness of his appearance had vanished. He was no longer the charlatan, the spellmumbling shaman. The starlight lent him a dignity which seemed to increase his very height, so that he stood like a white-bearded patriarch. Bran, your doubt lies there. The lean arm pointed to the fourth ring of fires. The king nodded gloomily. Cormac, you know as well as I, tomorrow's battle hinges upon that circle of fires. With the chariots of the Britons and your own western horsemen, our success would be certain, but surely the devil himself is in the heart of every Northman. You know how I trapped that band, how they swore to fight for me against Rome. And now that their chief, Ragnar, is dead, they swear that they will be led only by a king of their own race. Else they will break their vow and go over to the Romans. Without them we are doomed, for we cannot change our former plan. Take heart, Bran, said Gunnar. Touch the jewel in your iron crown. Mayhap it will bring you aid. Bran laughed bitterly. Now you talk as the people think. I am no fool to twist with empty words. What of the gem? It is a strange one, truth, and has brought me luck ere now. But I need now no jewels, but the allegiance of 300 fickle Northmen who are the only warriors among us who may stand the charge of the legions on foot. But the jewel, Bran, the jewel, persisted Gunnar. Well, the jewel, cried Bran impatiently. It is older than this world. It was old when Atlantis and Lemuria sank into the sea. It was given to Brule, the spear slayer, first of my line, by the Atlantean Kull, king of Valusia, in the days when the world was young. But shall that profit us now? Who knows? Asked the wizard obliquely. Time and space exist not. There was no past, and there shall be no future. Now is all. All things that ever were, are, or ever will be, transpire now. Man is forever at the center of what we call time and space. I have gone into yesterday and tomorrow, and both were as real as today, which is like the dreams of ghosts. But let me sleep and talk with Gunnar. Mayhap he shall aid us. What means he? Asked Cormac, with a slight twitching of his shoulders, as the priest strode away in the shadows. He has ever said that the first Gunnar comes to him in his dreams and talks with him, answered Bran. I have seen him perform deeds that seemed beyond human ken. I know not. I am but an unknown king with an iron crown, trying to lift a race of savages out of the slime into which they have sunk. Let us look to the camps. As they walked, Cormac wondered. By what strange freak of fate had such a man risen among this race of savages, survivors of a darker, grimmer age? Surely he was an atavism, an original type of the days when the Picts ruled all Europe, before their primitive empire fell before the bronze swords of the Gauls. Cormac knew how Bran, rising by his own efforts from the negligent position of the son of a wolf clan chief, had to an extent united the tribes of the Heather, and now claimed kingship over all Caledon. But his rule was loose, and much remained before the Pictish clans would forget their feuds and present a solid front to foreign foes. On the Battle of the Moro, the first pitched battle between the Picts under their king and the Romans, hinged the future of the rising Pictish kingdom. Bran and his ally walked through the Pictish camp where the swart warriors lay sprawled about their small fires, sleeping or gnawing half-cooked food. Cormac was impressed by their silence. 1,000 men camped here, yet the only sounds were occasional low guttural intonations. The silence of the Stone Age rested in the souls of these men. They were all short, most of them crooked of limb. Giant dwarfs. Bran Mac Morn was a tall man among them. Only the older men were bearded, and they scantily, but their black hair fell about their eyes so that they peered fiercely from under the tangle. They were barefoot, and clad scantily in wolfskins. Their arms consisted in short barbed swords of iron, heavy black bows, arrows tipped with flint, iron and copper, and stone-headed mallets. Defensive armor they had none, save for a crude shield of hide-covered wood. Many had worked bits of metal into their tangled manes as a slight protection against sword cuts. Some few, sons of long lines of chiefs, were smooth-limbed and lithe like Bran, but in the eyes of all gleamed the unquenchable savagery of the primeval. These men are fully savages, thought Cormac, worse than the Gauls, Britons and Germans. Can the old legends be true, that they reigned in a day when strange cities rose where now the sea rolls, and that they survived the flood that washed those gleaming empires under, sinking again into that savagery from which they once had risen? Close to the encampment of the tribesmen were the fires of a group of Britons, members of fierce tribes who lived south of the Roman wall but who dwelt in the hills and forests to the west and defied the power of Rome. Powerfully built men they were, with blazing blue eyes and shocks of tousled yellow hair, such men as had thronged the Saintish beaches when Caesar brought the eagles into the isles. These men, like the Picts, wore no armor, and were clad scantily in coarse-worked cloth and deerskin sandals. They bore small round bucklers of hard wood, braced with bronze, to be worn on the left arm, and long heavy bronze swords with blunt points. Some had bows, though the Britons were indifferent archers. Their bows were shorter than the Picts and effective only at close range. But ranged close by their fires were the weapons that had made the name Briton a word of terror to Pict, Roman and Norse raider alike. Within the circle of firelight stood 50 bronze chariots, with long, cruel blades curving out from the sides. One of these blades could dismember half a dozen men at once. Tethered close by under the vigilant eyes of their guards grazed the chariot horses, big, rangy steeds, swift and powerful. "Would that we had more of them," mused Bran. "With 1,000 chariots and my bowmen I could drive the legions into the sea." "The free British tribes must eventually fall before Rome," said Cormac. "It would seem they would rush to join you in your war." Bran made a helpless gesture. "The fickleness of the Celt. They cannot forget old feuds. Our ancient men have told us how they would not even unite against Caesar when the Romans first came. They will not make head against a common foe together. These men came to me because of some dispute with their chief, but I cannot depend on them when they are not actually fighting." Cormac nodded. "I know. Caesar conquered Gaul by playing one tribe against another. My own people shift and change with the waxing and waning of the tides. But of all Celts, the Cymri are the most changeable, the least stable. Not many centuries ago my own Gaelic ancestors wrested Erin from the Cymric Danans, because though they outnumbered us, they opposed us as separate tribes, rather than as a nation. And so these Cymric Britons face Rome," said Bran. "These will aid us on the morrow. Further I cannot say. But how shall I expect loyalty from alien tribes, who am not sure of my own people? Thousands lurk in the hills, holding aloof. I am king in name only. Let me win tomorrow and they will flock to my standard. If I lose, they will scatter like birds before a cold wind." A chorus of rough welcome greeted the two leaders as they entered the camp of Cormac's Gaels. 500 in number they were, tall rangy men, black-haired and grey-eyed mainly, with the bearing of men who lived by war alone. While there was nothing like close discipline among them, there was an air of more system and practical order than existed in the lines of the Picts and Britons. These men were of the last Celtic race to invade the Isles, and their barbaric civilization was of much higher order than that of their Cymric kin. The ancestors of the Gaels had learned the arts of war on the vast plains of Scythia and at the courts of the pharaohs where they had fought as mercenaries of Egypt, and much of what they learned they brought into Ireland with them. Excelling in metalwork, they were armed, not with clumsy bronze swords, but with high-grade weapons of iron. They were clad in well-woven kilts and leathern sandals. Each wore a light shirt of chain mail and a visorless helmet, but this was all of their defensive armor. Celts, Gaelic or Brythonic, were prone to judge a man's valor by the amount of armor he wore. The Britons who faced Caesar deemed the Romans cowards because they cased themselves in metal, and many centuries later the Irish clans thought the same of the mail-clad Norman knights of Strangbo. Cormac's warriors were horsemen. They neither knew nor esteemed the use of the bow. They bore the inevitable round, metal-braced buckler, dirks, long straight swords and light single-handed axes. Their tethered horses grazed not far away, big-boned animals, not so ponderous as those raised by the Britons, but swifter. Bran's eyes lighted as the two strode through the camp. "These men are keen-beaked birds of war. See how they whet their axes and jest of the morrow. Would that the raiders in yon camp were as staunch as your men, Cormac! Then would I greet the legions with a laugh when they come up from the south tomorrow." They were entering the circle of the Northmen fires. 300 men sat about gambling, whetting their weapons and drinking deep of the heather ale furnished them by their Pictish allies. These gazed upon Bran and Cormac with no great friendliness. It was striking to note the difference between them and the Picts and Celts, the difference in their cold eyes, their strong moody faces, their very bearing. Here was ferocity and savagery, but not of the wild, upbursting fury of the Celt. Here was fierceness backed by grim determination and stolid stubbornness. The charge of the British clans was terrible, overwhelming. But they had no patience. Let them be balked of immediate victory, and they were likely to lose heart and scatter or fall to bickering among themselves. There was the patience of the cold blue north in these seafarers, a lasting determination that would keep them steadfast to the bitter end, once their face was set toward a definite goal. As to personal stature, they were giants, massive yet rangy. That they did not share the ideas of the Celts regarding armor was shown by the fact that they were clad in heavy scale mail shirts that reached below mid-thigh, heavy horned helmets, and hardened hide leggings, reinforced, as were their shoes, with plates of iron. Their shields were huge oval affairs of hard wood, hide and brass. As to weapons, they had long iron-headed spears, heavy iron axes, and daggers. Some had long wide-bladed swords. Cormac scarcely felt at ease with the cold magnetic eyes of these flaxen-haired men fixed upon him. He and they were hereditary foes, even though they did chance to be fighting on the same side at present. But were they? A man came forward, a tall gaunt warrior on whose scarred, wolfish face the flickering firelight reflected deep shadows. With his wolfskin mantle flung carelessly about his wide shoulders, and the great horns on his helmet adding to his height, he stood there in the swaying shadows, like some half-human thing, a brooding shape of the dark barbarism that was soon to engulf the world. "Well, Wulfhere," said the Pictish king, "you have drunk the mead of council and have spoken about the fires. What is your decision?" The Northman's eyes flashed in the gloom. "Give us a king of our own race to follow if you wish us to fight for you." Bran flung out his hands. "Ask me to drag down the stars to gem your helmets. Will not your comrades follow you?" "Not against the legions," answered Wulfhere sullenly. "A king led us on the Viking path, a king must lead us against the Romans. And Ragnar is dead." "I am a king," said Bran. "Will you fight for me if I stand at the tip of your fight wedge?" "A king of our own race," said Wulfhere doggedly. "We are all picked men of the north. We fight for none but a king, and a king must lead us against the legions." Cormac sensed a subtle threat in this repeated phrase. "Here is a prince of Erin," said Bran. "Will you fight for the Westerner?" "We fight under no Celt, west or east," growled the Viking, and a low rumble of approval rose from the onlookers. "It is enough to fight by their side." The hot Gaelic blood rose in Cormac's brain, and he pushed past Bran, his hand on his sword. "How mean you that, pirate?" Before Wulfhere could reply, Bran interposed. "Have done! Will you fools throw away the battle before it is fought by your madness? What of your oath, Wulfhere?" "We swore it under Ragnar. When he died from a Roman arrow we were absolved of it. We will follow only a king, against the legions." "But your comrades will follow you, against the Heather people," snapped Bran. "Aye." The Northman's eyes met his brazenly. "Send us a king or we join the Romans tomorrow." Bran snarled. In his rage he dominated the scene, dwarfing the huge men who towered over him. Traitors! Liars! I hold your lives in my hand. Aye, draw your swords if you will. Cormac, keep your blade in its sheath. These wolves will not bite a king. Wulfhere, I spared your lives when I could have taken them. You came to raid the countries of the south, sweeping down from the northern sea in your galleys. You ravaged the coasts, and the smoke of burning villages hung like a cloud over the shores of Caledon. I trapped you all when you were pillaging and burning, with the blood of my people on your hands. I burned your long ships and ambushed you when you followed. With thrice your number of bowmen who burned for your lives hidden in the heathered hills about you, I spared you when we could have shot you down like trapped wolves. Because I spared you, you swore to come and fight for me. And shall we die because the Picts fight Rome? Rumbled the bearded raider. Your lives are forfeit to me. You came to ravage the south. I did not promise to send you all back to your homes in the north unharmed and loaded with loot. Your vow was to fight one battle against Rome under my standard. Then I will aid your survivors to build ships, and you may go where you will, with a goodly share of the plunder we take from the legions. Ragnar had kept his oath. But Ragnar died in a skirmish with Roman scouts, and now you, Wulfhere the dissension breeder, you stir up your comrades to dishonor themselves by that which a Northman hates, the breaking of the sworn word. We break no oath, snarled the Viking, and the king sensed the basic Germanic stubbornness, far harder to combat than the fickleness of the fiery Celts. Give us a king, neither Pict, Gael nor Briton, and we will die for you. If not, then we will fight tomorrow for the greatest of all kings, the Emperor of Rome. For a moment Cormac thought that the Pictish king, in his black rage, would draw and strike the Northmen dead. The concentrated fury that blazed in Bran's dark eyes caused Wulfhere to recoil and drop a hand to his belt. Fool! Said Mac Morn in a low voice that vibrated with passion. I could sweep you from the earth before the Romans are near enough to hear your death howls. Choose, fight for me on the morrow, or die tonight under a black cloud of arrows, a red storm of swords, a dark wave of chariots. At the mention of the chariots, the only arm of war that had ever broken the Norse shield wall, Wulfhere changed expression, but he held his ground. War be it, he said doggedly, or a king to lead us. The Northman responded with a short deep roar and a clash of swords on shields. Bran, eyes blazing, was about to speak again when a white shape glided silently into the ring of firelight. Soft words, said old Gunnar tranquilly. King, say no more. Wulfhere, you and your fellows will fight for us if you have a king to lead you? We have sworn. Then be at ease, quoth the wizard. For ere battle joins on the morrow I will send you such a king as no man on earth has followed for 100,000 years. A king neither Pict, Gael nor Briton, but one to whom the Emperor of Rome is as but a village headman. While they stood undecided, Gunnar took the arms of Cormac and Bran. Come! And you, Northmen, remember your vow, and my promise which I have never broken. Sleep now, nor think to steal away in the darkness to the Roman camp, for if you escaped our shafts you would not escape either my curse or the suspicions of the legionaries. So the three walked away, and Cormac, looking back, saw Wulfhere standing by the fire, fingering his golden beard, with a look of puzzled anger on his lean, evil face. The three walked silently through the waving heather under the faraway stars while the weird night wind whispered ghostly secrets about them. Ages ago, said the wizard suddenly, in the days when the world was young, great lands rose where now the ocean roars. On these lands thronged mighty nations and kingdoms. Greatest of all these was Valusia, land of enchantment. Rome is as a village compared to the splendor of the cities of Valusia. And the greatest king was Kull, who came from the land of Atlantis to wrest the crown of Valusia from a degenerate dynasty. The Picts who dwelt in the isles which now form the mountain peaks of a strange land upon the western ocean, were allies of Valusia, and the greatest of all the Pictish war chiefs was Brule the Spear Slayer, first of the line men call Mac Morn. Kull gave to Brule the jewel which you now wear in your iron crown, O king, after a strange battle in a dim land, and down the long ages it has come to us, ever a sign of the Mac Morn, a symbol of former greatness. When at last the sea rose and swallowed Valygia, Atlantis, and Lemuria, only the Picts survived, and they were scattered and few. Yet they began again the slow climb upward, and though many of the arts of civilization were lost in the great flood, yet they progressed. The art of metalworking was lost, so they excelled in the working of flint. And they ruled all the new lands flung up by the sea and now called Europe, until down from the north came younger tribes who had scarce risen from the ape when Valygia reigned in her glory, and who, dwelling in the icy lands about the pole, knew naught of the lost splendor of the 7 empires and little of the flood that had swept away half a world. And still they have come, Aryans, Celts, Germans, swarming down from the great cradle of their race which lies near the pole. So again was the growth of the Pictish nation checked and the race hurled into savagery. Erased from the earth, on the fringe of the world with our backs to the wall we fight. Here in Caledon is the last stand of a once mighty race. And we change. Our people have mixed with the savages of an elder age which we drove into the north when we came into the Isles, and now, save for their chieftains, such as thou, Bran, a Pict is strange and abhorrent to look upon. True, true, said the king impatiently. But what has that to do? Kull, king of Valygia, said the wizard imperturbably, was a barbarian in his age as thou art in thine, though he ruled a mighty empire by the weight of his sword. Gunnar, friend of Brule, your first ancestor, has been dead 100,000 years as we reckon time. Yet I talked with him a scant hour agone. You talked with his ghost. Or he with mine? Did I go back 100,000 years, or did he come forward? If he came to me out of the past, it is not I who talked with a dead man, but he who talked with a man unborn. Past, present, and future are one to a wise man. I talked to Gunnar while he was alive, likewise was I alive. In a timeless, spaceless land we met, and he told me many things. The land was growing light with the birth of dawn. The heather waved and bent in long rows before the dawn wind as bowing in worship of the rising sun. The jewel in your crown is a magnet that draws down the eons, said Gunnar. The sun is rising, and who comes out of the sunrise? Cormac and the king started. The sun was just lifting a red orb above the eastern hills. And full in the glow, etched boldly against the golden rim, a man suddenly appeared. They had not seen him come. Against the golden birth of day he loomed colossal, a gigantic god from the dawn of creation. Now as he strode toward them the waking host saw him and sent up a sudden shout of wonder. Who or what is it? Exclaimed Bran. Let us go to meet him, Bran, answered the wizard. He is the king Gunnar has sent to save the people of Brule. Chapter 2. I have reached these lands but newly from an ultimate dim Thule. From a wild weird climb that leads sublime out of space, out of time. Poe. The army fell silent as Bran, Cormac, and Gunnar went toward the stranger who approached in long swinging strides. As they neared him the illusion of monstrous size vanished, but they saw he was a man of great stature. At first Cormac thought him to be a Northman, but a second glance told him that nowhere before had he seen such a man. He was built much like the Vikings, at once massive and lithe, tigerish. But his features were not as theirs, and his square-cut, lion-like mane of hair was as black as Bran's own. Under heavy brows glittered eyes gray as steel and cold as ice. His bronze face, strong and inscrutable, was clean-shaven, and the broad forehead betokened a high intelligence, just as the firm jaw and thin lips showed willpower and courage. But more than all, the bearing of him, the unconscious lion-like stateliness, marked him as a natural king, a ruler of men. Sandals of curious make were on his feet, and he wore a pliant coat of strangely meshed mail, which came almost to his knees. A broad belt with a great golden buckle encircled his waist, supporting a long straight sword in a heavy leather scabbard. His hair was confined by a wide, heavy golden band about his head. Such was the man who paused before the silent group. He seemed slightly puzzled, slightly amused. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He spoke in a strange archaic Pictish which Cormac scarcely understood. His voice was deep and resonant. Ha, Brule, Goner did not tell me I would dream of you. For the first time in his life, Cormac saw the Pictish king completely thrown off his balance. He gaped, speechless. The stranger continued. And wearing the gem I gave you, in a circlet on your head. Last night you wore it in a ring on your finger. Last night? Gasped Bran. Last night or 100,000 years ago, all one, murmured Goner in evident enjoyment of the situation. I am not Brule, said Bran. Are you mad to thus speak of a man dead 100,000 years? He was first of my line. The stranger laughed unexpectedly. Well, now I know I am dreaming. This will be a tale to tell Brule when I waken on the morrow. That I went into the future and saw men claiming descent from the spear slayer who is, as yet, not even married. No, you are not Brule, I see now, though you have his eyes and his bearing. But he is taller and broader in the shoulders. Yet you have his jewel. Oh, well, anything can happen in a dream, so I will not quarrel with you. For a time I thought I had been transported to some other land in my sleep, and was in reality awake in a strange country, for this is the clearest dream I ever dreamed. Who are you? I am Bran Mac Morn, king of the Caledonian Picts. And this ancient is Goner, a wizard, of the line of Goner. And this warrior is Cormac na Connacht, a prince of the Isle of Arran. The stranger slowly shook his lion-like head. These words sound strangely to me, save Goner, and that one is not Goner, though he too is old. What land is this? Caledon, or Alba, as the Gaels call it. And who are those squat ape-like warriors who watch us yonder, all agape? They are the Picts who own my rule. How strangely distorted folk are in dreams, muttered the stranger. And who are those shock-headed men about the chariots? They are Britons, Cymry from south of the wall. What wall? The wall built by Rome to keep the people of the heather out of Britain. Britain? The tone was curious. I never heard of that land, and what is Rome? What? Cried Bran. You never heard of Rome, the empire that rules the world? No empire rules the world, answered the other haughtily. The mightiest kingdom on earth is that wherein I reign. And who are you? Cull of Atlantis, king of Valusia. Cormac felt a coldness trickle down his spine. The cold grey eyes were unswerving, but this was incredible, monstrous, unnatural. Valusia! Cried Bran. Why, man, the sea waves have rolled above the spires of Valusia for untold centuries. Cull laughed outright. What a mad nightmare this is! When Goner put on me the spell of deep sleep last night, or this night, in the secret room of the inner palace, he told me I would dream strange things, but this is more fantastic than I reckoned. And the strangest thing is, I know I am dreaming. Goner interposed as Bran would have spoken. Question not the acts of the gods, muttered the wizard. You are king because in the past you have seen and seized opportunities. The gods or the first Goner have sent you this man. Let me deal with him. Bran nodded, and while the silent army gaped in speechless wonder, just within earshot, Goner spoke. O great king, you dream, but is not all life a dream? How reckon you but that your former life is but a dream from which you have just awakened? Now we dream folk have our wars and our peace, and just now a great host comes up from the south to destroy the people of Brule. Will you aid us? Cull grinned with pure zest. I have fought battles in dreams ere now, have slain and been slain, and was amazed when I woke from my visions. And at times, as now, dreaming I have known I dreamed. See, I pinch myself and feel it, but I know I dream, for I have felt the pain of fierce wounds, in dreams. Yes, people of my dream, I will fight for you against the other dream folk. Where are they? And that you enjoyed the dream more, said the wizard subtly. Forget that it is a dream and pretend that by the magic of the first Goner, and the quality of the jewel you gave Brule, that now gleams on the crown of the Morny, you have in truth been transported forward into another, wilder age where the people of Brule fight for their life against a stronger foe. For a moment the man who called himself King of Valusia seemed startled. A strange look of doubt, almost of fear, clouded his eyes. Then he laughed. Good! Lead on, wizard! But now Bran took charge. He had recovered himself, and was at ease. Whether he thought, like Cormac, that this was all a gigantic hoax arranged by Gonner, he showed no sign. King Kull, see you those men yonder who lean on their long-shafted axes as they gaze upon you? The tall men with the golden hair and beards? Aye, our success in the coming battle hinges on them. They swear to go over to the enemy if we give them not a king to lead them, their own having been slain. Will you lead them to battle? Kull's eyes glowed with appreciation. They are men such as my own Red Slayers, my picked regiment. I will lead them. Come then. The small group made their way down the slope, through throngs of warriors who pushed forward eagerly to get a better view of the stranger, then pressed back as he approached. An undercurrent of tense whispering ran through the horde. The Northmen stood apart in a compact group. Their cold eyes took in Kull and he gave back their stares, taking in every detail of their appearance. Wulfhere, said Bran, we have brought you a king. I hold you to your oath. Let him speak to us, said the Viking harshly. He cannot speak your tongue, answered Bran, knowing that the Northmen knew nothing of the legends of his race. He is a great king of the south. He comes out of the past, broke in the wizard calmly. He was the greatest of all kings long ago. A dead man! The Vikings moved uneasily and the rest of the horde pressed forward, drinking in every word. But Wulfhere scowled. Shall a ghost lead living men? You bring us a man you say is dead. We will not follow a corpse. Wulfhere, said Bran in still passion, you are a liar and a traitor. You set us this task, thinking it impossible. You yearn to fight under the eagles of Rome. We have brought you a king neither Pict, Gael nor Briton, and you deny your vow. Let him fight me, then, howled Wulfhere in uncontrollable wrath, swinging his axe about his head in a glittering arc. If your dead man overcomes me, then my people will follow you. If I overcome him, you shall let us depart in peace to the camp of the legions. Good, said the wizard. Do you agree, wolves of the north? A fierce yell and a brandishing of swords was the answer. Bran turned to Kull, who had stood silent, understanding nothing of what was said. But the Atlantean's eyes gleamed. Cormac felt that those cold eyes had looked on too many such scenes not to understand something of what had passed. This warrior says you must fight him for the leadership, said Bran, and Kull, eyes glittering with growing battle joy, nodded. I guessed as much. Give us space. A shield and a helmet, shouted Bran, but Kull shook his head. I need none, he growled. Back and give us room to swing our steel. Men pressed back on each side, forming a solid ring about the two men, who now approached each other warily. Kull had drawn his sword and the great blade shimmered like a live thing in his hand. Wulfhere, scarred by 100 savage fights, flung aside his wolfskin mantle and came in cautiously, fierce eyes peering over the top of his outthrust shield, axe half lifted in his right hand. Suddenly, when the warriors were still many feet apart, Kull sprang. His attack brought a gasp from men used to deeds of prowess, for like a leaping tiger he shot through the air and his sword crashed on the quickly lifted shield. Sparks flew and Wulfhere's axe hacked in, but Kull was under its sweep, and as it swished viciously above his head he thrust upward and sprang out again, cat-like. His motions had been too quick for the eye to follow. The upper edge of Wulfhere's shield showed a deep cut, and there was a long rent in his mail shirt, where Kull's sword had barely missed the flesh beneath. Cormac, trembling with the terrible thrill of the fight, wondered at this sword that could thus slice through scale mail, and the blow that gashed the shield should have shattered the blade. Yet not a notch showed in the Valysian steel. Surely this blade was forged by another people in another age. Now the two giants leaped again to the attack, and like double strokes of lightning their weapons crashed. Wulfhere's shield fell from his arm in two pieces as the Atlantean's sword sheared clear through it, and Kull staggered as the Northman's axe, driven with all the force of his great body, descended on the golden circlet about his head. That blow should have sheared through the gold like butter to split the skull beneath, but the axe rebounded, showing a great notch in the edge. The next instant the Northman was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of steel, a storm of strokes delivered with such swiftness and power that he was borne back as on the crest of a wave, unable to launch an attack of his own. With all his tried skill he sought to parry the singing steel with his axe. But he could only avert his doom for a few seconds, could only for an instant turn the whistling blade that hewed off bits of his mail, so close fell the blows. One of the horns flew from his helmet, then the axe head itself fell away, and the same blow that severed the handle bit through the Viking's helmet into the scalp beneath. Wulfher was dashed to his knees, a trickle of blood starting down his face. Kull checked his second stroke, and tossing his sword to Cormac, faced the dazed Northman weaponless. The Atlantean's eyes were blazing with ferocious joy, and he roared something in a strange tongue. Wulfher gathered his legs under him and bounded up, snarling like a wolf, a dagger flashing into his hand. The watching horde gave tongue in a yell that ripped the skies as the two bodies clashed. Kull's clutching hand missed the Northman's wrist, but the desperately lunging dagger snapped on the Atlantean's mail, and dropping the useless hilt, Wulfher locked his arms about his foe in a bear-like grip that would have crushed the ribs of a lesser man. Kull grinned tigerishly and returned the grapple, and for a moment the two swayed on their feet. Slowly the black-haired warrior bent his foe backward until it seemed his spine would snap. With a howl that had nothing of the human in it, Wulfher clawed frantically at Kull's face, trying to tear out his eyes, then turned his head and snapped his fawn-like teeth into the Atlantean's arm. A yell went up as a trickle of blood started. "He bleeds! He bleeds! He is no ghost, after all, but a mortal man!" Angered, Kull shifted his grip, shoving the frothing Wulfher away from him, and smote him terrifically under the ear with his right hand. The Viking landed on his back a dozen feet away. Then, howling like a wild man, he leaped up with a stone in his hand and flung it. Only Kull's incredible quickness saved his face. As it was, the rough edge of the missile tore his cheek and inflamed him to madness. With a lion-like roar he bounded upon his foe, enveloped him in an irresistible blast of sheer fury, whirled him high above his head as if he were a child and cast him a dozen feet away. Wulfher pitched on his head and lay still, broken and dead. Dazed silence reigned for an instant, then from the gales went up a thundering roar, and the Britons and Picts took it up, howling like wolves, until the echoes of the shouts and the clangor of sword on shield reached the ears of the marching legionaries, miles to the south. "Men of the Grey North," shouted Bran, "will you hold by your oath now?" The fierce souls of the Northmen were in their eyes as their spokesman answered. Primitive, superstitious, steeped in tribal lore of fighting gods and mythical heroes, they did not doubt that the black-haired fighting man was some supernatural being sent by the fierce gods of battle. "Aye. Such a man as this we have never seen. Dead man, ghost or devil, we will follow him, whether the trail lead to Rome or Valhalla." Kull understood the meaning, if not the words. Taking his sword from Cormac with a word of thanks, he turned to the waiting Northmen and silently held the blade toward them high above his head, in both hands, before he returned it to its scabbard. Without understanding, they appreciated the action. Blood-stained and disheveled, he was an impressive picture of stately, magnificent barbarism. "Come," said Bran, touching the Atlantean's arm. "A host is marching on us and we have much to do. There is scant time to arrange our forces before they will be upon us. Come to the top of yonder slope." There the pick pointed. They were looking down into a valley which ran north and south, widening from a narrow gorge in the north until it debouched upon a plain to the south. The whole valley was less than a mile in length. "Up this valley will our foes come," said the Pict, "because they have wagons loaded with supplies, and on all sides of this vale the ground is too rough for such travel. Here we plan an ambush." "I would have thought you would have had your men lying in wait long before now," said Kull. "What of the scouts the enemy is sure to send out?" The savages I lead would never have waited in ambush so long, said Bran with a touch of bitterness. I could not post them until I was sure of the Northmen. Even so, I had not dared to post them ere now. Even yet they may take panic from the drifting of a cloud or the blowing of a leaf, and scatter like birds before a cold wind. King Kull, the fate of the Pictish nation is at stake. I am called King of the Picts, but my rule as yet is but a hollow mockery. The hills are full of wild clans who refuse to fight for me. Of the 1,000 bowmen now at my command, more than half are of my own clan. Some 1,800 Romans are marching against us. It is not a real invasion, but much hinges upon it. It is the beginning of an attempt to extend their boundaries. They plan to build a fortress a day's march to the north of this valley. If they do, they will build other forts, drawing bands of steel about the heart of the free people. If I win this battle and wipe out this army, I will win a double victory. Then the tribes will flock to me and the next invasion will meet a solid wall of resistance. If I lose, the clans will scatter, fleeing into the north until they can no longer flee, fighting as separate clans rather than as one strong nation. I have 1,000 archers, 500 horsemen, 50 chariots with their drivers and swordsmen, 150 men in all, and thanks to you, 300 heavily armed northern pirates. How would you arrange your battle lines? Well, said Kull, I would have barricaded the north end of the valley. No! That would suggest a trap. But I would block it with a band of desperate men, like those you have given me to lead. 300 could hold the gorge for a time against any number. Then, when the enemy was engaged with these men to the narrow part of the valley, I would have my archers shoot down into them until their ranks are broken, from both sides of the vale. Then, having my horsemen concealed behind one ridge and my chariots behind the other, I would charge with both simultaneously and sweep the foe into a red ruin. Bran's eyes glowed. Exactly, King of Valyria. Such was my exact plan. But what of the scouts? My warriors are like panthers, they hide under the noses of the Romans. Those who ride into the valley will see only what we wish them to see. Those who ride over the ridge will not come back to report. An arrow is swift and silent. You see that the pivot of the whole thing depends on the men that hold the gorge. They must be men who can fight on foot and resist the charges of the heavy legionaries long enough for the trap to close. Outside these Northmen I had no such force of men. My naked warriors with their short swords could never stand such a charge for an instant. Nor is the armor of the Celts made for such work. Moreover, they are not foot fighters, and I need them elsewhere. So you see why I had such desperate need of the Northmen. Now will you stand in the gorge with them and hold back the Romans until I can spring the trap? Remember, most of you will die. Kull smiled. I have taken chances all my life, though too, Chief Counselor would say my life belongs to Valyria and I have no right to so risk it. His voice trailed off and a strange look flitted across his face. By Valka, said he, laughing uncertainly. Sometimes I forget this is a dream. All seems so real. But it is, of course it is. Well then, if I die I will but awaken as I have done in times past. Lead on, King of Kaladin! Cormac, going to his warriors, wondered. Surely it was all a hoax. Yet, he heard the arguments of the warriors all about him as they armed themselves and prepared to take their posts. The black-haired king was Nade himself, the Celtic war god. He was an antediluvian king brought out of the past by Gunnar. He was a mythical fighting man out of Valhalla. He was no man at all but a ghost. No, he was mortal, for he had bled. But the gods themselves bled, though they did not die. So the controversies raged. At least, thought Cormac, if it was all a hoax to inspire the warriors with the feeling of supernatural aid, it had succeeded. The belief that Kull was more than a mortal man had fired Celt, Pict and Viking alike into a sort of inspired madness. And Cormac asked himself, what did he himself believe? This man was surely one from some far land, yet in his every look and action there was a vague hint of a greater difference than mere distance of space, a hint of alien time, of misty abysses and gigantic gulfs of aeons lying between the black-haired stranger and the men with whom he walked and talked. Clouds of bewilderment mazed Cormac's brain, and he laughed in whimsical self-mockery. Chapter 3. And the two wild peoples of the north stood fronting in the gloam, and heard and knew each in his mind a third great sound upon the wind, the living walls that hedge mankind, the walking walls of Rome. Chesterton. The sun slanted westward. Silence lay like an invisible mist over the valley. Cormac gathered the reins in his hand and glanced up at the ridges on both sides. The waving heather which grew rank on those steep slopes gave no evidence of the hundreds of savage warriors who lurked there. Here in the narrow gorge which widened gradually southward was the only sign of life. Between the steep walls 300 Northmen were massed solidly in their wedge-shaped shield wall, blocking the pass. At the tip, like the point of a spear, stood the man who called himself Cull, king of Valygia. He wore no helmet, only the great, strangely worked headband of hard gold, but he bore on his left arm the great shield borne by the dead Ragnar, and in his right hand he held the heavy iron mace wielded by the Sea King. The Vikings eyed him in wonder and savage admiration. They could not understand his language, or he theirs. But no further orders were necessary. At Bran's directions they had bunched themselves in the gorge, and their only order was, "Hold the pass." Bran Mac Morn stood just in front of Cull. So they faced each other, he whose kingdom was yet unborn, and he whose kingdom had been lost in the mists of time for unguessed ages. Kings of darkness, thought Cormac, nameless kings of the night, whose realms are gulfs and shadows. The hand of the Pictish king went out. "King Cull, you are more than king, you are a man. Both of us may fall within the next hour, but if we both live, ask what you will of me." Cull smiled, returning the firm grip. "You too are a man after my own heart, king of the shadows. Surely you are more than a figment of my sleeping imagination. Mayhap we will meet in waking life some day." Bran shook his head in puzzlement, swung into the saddle and rode away, climbing the eastern slope and vanishing over the ridge. Cormac hesitated. "Strange man, are you in truth of flesh and blood, or are you a ghost?" "When we dream, we are all flesh and blood, so long as we are dreaming," Cull answered. "This is the strangest nightmare I have ever known, but you, who will soon fade into sheer nothingness as I awaken, seem as real to me now, as Brule, or Cananu, or Tu, or Kelka." Cormac shook his head as Bran had done, and with a last salute, which Cull returned with barbaric stateliness, he turned and trotted away. At the top of the western ridge he paused. Away to the south a light cloud of dust rose and the head of the marching column was in sight. Already he believed he could feel the earth vibrate slightly to the measured tread of 1,000 mailed feet beating in perfect unison. He dismounted, and one of his chieftains, Domhnall, took his steed and led it down the slope away from the valley, where trees grew thickly. Only an occasional vague movement among them gave evidence of the 500 men who stood there, each at his horse's head with a ready hand to check a chance nicker. Oh, thought Cormac, the gods themselves made this valley for Bran's ambush. The floor of the valley was treeless, and the inner slopes were bare save for the waist-high heather. But at the foot of each ridge on the side facing away from the vale, where the soil long washed from the rocky slopes had accumulated, there grew enough trees to hide 500 horsemen or 50 chariots. At the northern end of the valley stood Cull and his 300 Vikings, in open view, flanked on each side by 50 Pictish bowmen. Hidden on the western side of the western ridge were the Gaels. Along the top of the slopes, concealed in the tall heather, lay 100 Picts with their shafts on string. The rest of the Picts were hidden on the eastern slopes beyond which lay the Britons with their chariots in full readiness. Neither they nor the Gaels to the west could see what went on in the vale, but signals had been arranged. Now the long column was entering the wide mouth of the valley and their scouts, light-armed men on swift horses, were spreading out between the slopes. They galloped almost within bowshot of the silent host that blocked the pass, then halted. Some whirled and raced back to the main force, while the others deployed and cantered up the slopes, seeking to see what lay beyond. This was the crucial moment. If they got any hint of the ambush, all was lost. Cormac, shrinking down into the heather, marveled at the ability of the Picts to efface themselves from view so completely. He saw a horseman pass within 3 feet of where he knew a bowman lay, yet the Romans saw nothing. The scouts topped the ridges, gazed about, then most of them turned and trotted back down the slopes. Cormac wondered at their desultory manner of scouting. He had never fought Romans before, knew nothing of their arrogant self-confidence, of their incredible shrewdness in some ways, their incredible stupidity in others. These men were overconfident, a feeling radiating from their officers. It had been years since a force of Caledonians had stood before the legions. And most of these men were but newly come to Britain, part of a legion which had been quartered in Egypt. They despised their foes and suspected nothing. But stay, 3 riders on the opposite ridge had turned and vanished on the other side. And now one, sitting his steed at the crest of the western ridge, not 100 yards from where Cormac lay, looked long and narrowly down into the mass of trees at the foot of the slope. Cormac saw suspicion grow on his brown, hawk-like face. He half turned as though to call to his comrades, then instead reined his steed down the slope, leaning forward in his saddle. Cormac's heart pounded. Each moment he expected to see the man wheel and gallop back to raise the alarm. He resisted a mad impulse to leap up and charge the Roman on foot. Surely the man could feel the tenseness in the air, the hundreds of fierce eyes upon him. Now he was halfway down the slope, out of sight of the men in the valley. And now the twang of an unseen bow broke the painful stillness. With a strangled gasp the Roman flung his hands high, and as the steed reared, he pitched headlong, transfixed by a long black arrow that had flashed from the heather. A stocky dwarf sprang out of nowhere, seemingly, and seized the bridle, quieting the snorting horse, and leading it down the slope. At the fall of the Roman, short crooked men rose like a sudden flight of birds from the grass, and Cormac saw the flash of a knife. Then with unreal suddenness all had subsided. Slayers and slain were unseen, and only the still waving heather marked the grim deed. The Gael looked back into the valley. The 3 who had ridden over the eastern ridge had not come back, and Cormac knew they never would. Evidently the other scouts had borne word that only a small band of warriors was ready to dispute the passage of the legionaries. Now the head of the column was almost below him, and he thrilled at the sight of these men who were doomed, swinging along with their superb arrogance. And the sight of their splendid armor, their hawk-like faces and perfect discipline awed him as much as it is possible for a Gael to be awed. 1,200 men in heavy armor who marched as one so that the ground shook to their tread. Most of them were of middle height, with powerful chests and shoulders and bronzed faces, hard-bitten veterans of 100 campaigns. Cormac noted their javelins, short keen swords and heavy shields, their gleaming armor and crested helmets, the eagles on the standards. These were the men beneath whose tread the world had shaken and empires crumbled. Not all were Latins. There were Romanized Britons among them, and 1 century or 100 was composed of huge yellow-haired men, Gauls and Germans, who fought for Rome as fiercely as did the native-born, and hated their wilder kinsmen more savagely. On each side was a swarm of cavalry, outriders, and the column was flanked by archers and slingers. A number of lumbering wagons carried the supplies of the army. Cormac saw the commander riding in his place, a tall man with a lean, imperious face, evident even at that distance. Marcus Tullius, the Gael knew him by repute. A deep-throated roar rose from the legionaries as they approached their foes. Evidently they intended to slice their way through and continue without a pause, for the column moved implacably on. Whom the gods destroy they first make mad. Cormac had never heard the phrase, but it came to him that the great Tullius was a fool. Roman arrogance. Marcus was used to lashing the cringing peoples of a decadent East. Little he guessed of the iron in these Western races. A group of cavalry detached itself and raced into the mouth of the gorge, but it was only a gesture. With loud jeering shouts they wheeled 3 spears' length away and cast their javelins, which rattled harmlessly on the overlapping shields of the silent Northmen. But their leader dared too much. Swinging in, He leaned from his saddle and thrust at Kull's face. The great shield turned the lance, and Kull struck back as a snake strikes. The ponderous mace crushed helmet and head like an eggshell, and the very steed went to its knees from the shock of that terrible blow. From the Northmen went up a short, fierce roar, and the Picts beside them howled exultantly and loosed their arrows among the retreating horsemen. First blood for the people of the heather. The oncoming Romans shouted vengefully and quickened their pace as the frightened horse raced by, a ghastly travesty of a man, foot caught in the stirrup, trailing beneath the pounding hoofs. Now the first line of the legionaries, compressed because of the narrowness of the gorge, crashed against the solid wall of shields, crashed and recoiled upon itself. The shield wall had not shaken an inch. This was the first time the Roman legions had met with that unbreakable formation, that oldest of all Aryan battle lines, the ancestor of the Spartan regiment, the Theban phalanx, the Macedonian formation, the English square. Shield crashed on shield, and the short Roman sword sought for an opening in that iron wall. Viking spears bristling in solid ranks above, thrust and reddened, heavy axes chopped down, shearing through iron, flesh and bone. Cormac saw Kull, looming above the stocky Romans in the forefront of the fray, dealing blows like thunderbolts. A burly centurion rushed in, shield held high, stabbing upward. The iron mace crashed terribly, shivering the sword, rending the shield apart, shattering the helmet, crushing the skull down between the shoulders, in a single blow. The front line of the Romans bent like a steel bar about the wedge, as the legionaries sought to struggle through the gorge on each side and surround their opposers. But the pass was too narrow. Crouching close against the steep walls, the Picts drove their black arrows in a hail of death. At this range the heavy shafts tore through shield and corselet, transfixing the armored men. The front line of battle rolled back, red and broken, and the Northmen trod their few dead underfoot to close the gaps their fall had made. Stretched the full width of their front lay a thin line of shattered forms, the red spray of the tide which had broken upon them in vain. Cormac had leaped to his feet, waving his arms. Dom Nail and his men broke cover at the signal and came galloping up the slope, lining the ridge. Cormac mounted the horse brought him, and glanced impatiently across the narrow vale. No sign of life appeared on the eastern ridge. Where was Bran, and the Britons? Down in the valley, the legions, angered at the unexpected opposition of the paltry force in front of them, but not suspicious, were forming in more compact body. The wagons which had halted were lumbering on again, and the whole column was once more in motion as if it intended to crash through by sheer weight. With the Gaulish sentry in the forefront, the legionaries were advancing again in the attack. This time, with the full force of 1,200 men behind, the charge would batter down the resistance of Kull's warriors like a heavy ram, would stamp them down, sweep over their red ruins. Cormac's men trembled in impatience. Suddenly Marcus Aurelius turned and gazed westward, where the line of horsemen was etched against the sky. Even at that distance Cormac saw his face pale. The Roman at last realized the mettle of the men he faced, and that he had walked into a trap. Surely in that moment there flashed a chaotic picture through his brain: defeat, disgrace, red ruin. It was too late to retreat, too late to form into a defensive square with the wagons for barricade. There was but one possible way out, and Marcus, crafty general in spite of his recent blunder, took it. Cormac heard his voice cut like a clarion through the din, and though he did not understand the words, he knew that the Roman was shouting for his men to smite that knot of Northmen like a blast, to hack their way through and out of the trap before it could close. Now the legionaries, aware of their desperate plight, flung themselves headlong and terribly on their foes. The shield wall rocked, but it gave not an inch. The wild faces of the Gauls and the hard brown Italian faces glared over locked shields into the blazing eyes of the north. Shields touching, they smote and slew and died in a red storm of slaughter, where crimson axes rose and fell and dripping spears broke on notched swords. Where in God's name was Bran with his chariots? A few minutes more would spell the doom of every man who held that pass. Already they were falling fast, though they locked their ranks closer and held like iron. Those wild men of the north were dying in their tracks, and looming among their golden heads the black lion mane of Kull shone like a symbol of slaughter, and his reddened mace showered a ghastly rain as it splashed brains and blood like water. Something snapped in Cormac's brain. "These men will die while we wait for Bran's signal," he shouted. "On! Follow me into hell, sons of Gael!" A wild roar answered him, and loosing rein he shot down the slope with 500 yelling riders plunging headlong after him. And even at that moment a storm of arrows swept the valley from either side like a dark cloud, and the terrible clamor of the Picts split the skies. And over the eastern ridge, like a sudden burst of rolling thunder on Judgment Day, rushed the war chariots. Headlong down the slope they roared, foam flying from the horses' distended nostrils, frantic feet scarcely seeming to touch the ground, making naught of the tall heather. In the foremost chariot, with his dark eyes blazing, crouched Bran Mac Morn, and in all of them the naked Britons were screaming and lashing as if possessed by demons. Behind the flying chariots came the Picts, howling like wolves and loosing their arrows as they ran. The heather belched them forth from all sides in a dark wave. So much Cormac saw in chaotic glimpses during that wild ride down the slopes. A wave of cavalry swept between him and the main line of the column. 3 long leaps ahead of his men, the Gaelic prince met the spears of the Roman riders. The first lance turned on his buckler, and rising in his stirrups he smote downward, cleaving his man from shoulder to breastbone. The next Roman flung a javelin that killed Domhnall, but at that instant Cormac's steed crashed into his, breast to breast, and the lighter horse rolled headlong under the shock, flinging his rider beneath the pounding hoofs. Then the whole blast of the Gaelic charge smote the Roman cavalry, shattering it, crashing and rolling it down and under. Over its red ruins Cormac's yelling demons struck the heavy Roman infantry, and the whole line reeled at the shock. Swords and axes flashed up and down, and the force of their rush carried them deep into the massed ranks. Here, checked, they swayed and strove. Javelins thrust, swords flashed upward, bringing down horse and rider, and greatly outnumbered, leaguered on every side, the Gaels had perished among their foes, but at that instant, from the other side the crashing chariots smote the Roman ranks. In one long line they struck almost simultaneously, and at the moment of impact the charioteers wheeled their horses sidelong and raced parallel down the ranks, shearing men down like the mowing of wheat. Hundreds died on those curving blades in that moment, and leaping from the chariots, screaming like blood-mad wildcats, the British swordsmen flung themselves upon the spears of the legionaries, hacking madly with their 2-handed swords. Crouching, the Picts drove their arrows point-blank and then sprang into slash and thrust. Maddened with the sight of victory, these wild peoples were like wounded tigers, feeling no wounds, and dying on their feet with their last gasp a snarl of fury. But the battle was not over yet. Dazed, shattered, their formation broken and nearly half their number down already, the Romans fought back with desperate fury. Hemmed in on all sides they slashed and smote singly, or in small clumps, fought back to back, archers, slingers, horsemen and heavy legionaries mingled into a chaotic mass. The confusion was complete, but not the victory. Those bottled in the gorge still hurled themselves upon the red axes that barred their way, while the massed and serried battle thundered behind them. From one side Cormac's Gaels raged and slashed, from the other chariots swept back and forth, retiring and returning like iron whirlwinds. There was no retreat, for the Picts had flung a cordon across the way they had come, and having cut the throats of the camp followers and possessed themselves of the wagons, they sent their shafts in a storm of death into the rear of the shattered column. Those long black arrows pierced armor and bone, nailing men together. Yet the slaughter was not all on one side. Picts died beneath the lightning thrust of javelin and short sword, Gaels pinned beneath their falling horses were hewed to pieces, and chariots, cut loose from their horses, were deluged with the blood of the charioteers. And at the narrow head of the valley still the battle surged and eddied. Great gods, thought Cormac, glancing between lightning-like blows, do these men still hold the gorge? Aye. They held it. 1/10 of their original number, dying on their feet, they still held back the frantic charges of the dwindling legionaries. Over all the field went up the roar and the clash of arms, and birds of prey, swift flying out of the sunset, circled above. Cormac, striving to reach Marcus Tullius through the press, saw the Roman's horse sink under him, and the rider rise alone in a waste of foes. He saw the Roman sword flash thrice, dealing a death at each blow, then from the thickest of the fray bounded a terrible figure. It was Bran Mac Morn, stained from head to foot. He cast away his broken sword as he ran, drawing a dirk. The Roman struck, but the Pictish king was under the thrust, and gripping the sword wrist, he drove the dirk again and again through the gleaming armor. A mighty roar went up as Marcus died, and Cormac, with a shout, rallied the remnants of his force about him and, striking in the spurs, burst through the shattered lines and rode full speed for the other end of the valley. But as he approached he saw that he was too late. As they had lived, so had they died, those fierce sea-wolves, with their faces to the foe and their broken weapons red in their hands. In a grim and silent band they lay, even in death preserving some of the shield wall formation. Among them, in front of them and all about them lay high-heaped the bodies of those who had sought to break them, in vain. They had not given back a foot. To the last man, they had died in their tracks. Nor were there any left to stride over their torn shapes. Those Romans who had escaped the Viking axes had been struck down by the shafts of the picks and swords of the Gaels from behind. Yet this part of the battle was not over. High up on the steep western slope Cormac saw the ending of that drama. A group of Gauls in the armor of Rome pressed upon a single man, a black-haired giant on whose head gleamed a golden crown. There was iron in these men, as well as in the man who had held them to their fate. They were doomed, their comrades were being slaughtered behind them, but before their turn came they would at least have the life of the black-haired chief who had led the golden-haired men of the north. Pressing upon him from three sides they had forced him slowly back up the steep gorge wall, and the crumpled bodies that stretched along his retreat showed how fiercely every foot of the way had been contested. Here on this steep it was task enough to keep one's footing alone, yet these men at once climbed and fought. Cull's shield and the huge mace were gone, and the great sword in his right hand was dyed crimson. His mail, wrought with a forgotten art, now hung in shreds, and blood streamed from 100 wounds on limbs, head and body. But his eyes still blazed with the battle joy, and his wearied arms still drove the mighty blade in strokes of death. But Cormac saw that the end would come before they could reach him. Now at the very crest of the steep, a hedge of points menaced the strange king's life, and even his iron strength was ebbing. Now he split the skull of a huge warrior and the backstroke shore through the neck cords of another. Reeling under a very rain of swords he struck again, and his victim dropped at his feet, cleft to the breastbone. Then, even as a dozen swords rose above the staggering Atlantean for the death stroke, a strange thing happened. The sun was sinking into the western sea. All the heather swam red like an ocean of blood. Etched in the dying sun, as he had first appeared, Cull stood, and then, like a mist lifting, a mighty vista opened behind the reeling king. Cormac's astounded eyes caught a fleeting gigantic glimpse of other climes and spheres. As if mirrored in summer clouds he saw, instead of the heather hills stretching away to the sea, a dim and mighty land of blue mountains and gleaming quiet lakes, the golden, purple and sapphirian spires and towering walls of a mighty city such as the earth has not known for many a drifting age. Then like the fading of a mirage it was gone. But the Gauls on the high slope had dropped their weapons and stared like men dazed, for the man called Cull had vanished, and there was no trace of his going. As in a daze Cormac turned his steed and rode back across the trampled field. His horse's hoofs splashed in lakes of blood and clanged against the helmets of dead men. Across the valley the shout of victory was thundering. Yet all seemed shadowy and strange. A shape was striding across the torn corpses, and Cormac was dully aware that it was Bran. The Gael swung from his horse and fronted the king. Bran was weaponless and gory. Blood trickled from gashes on brow, breast and limb. What armor he had worn was clean hacked away, and a cut had shorn halfway through his iron crown. But the red jewels still gleamed unblemished like a star of slaughter. "It is in my mind to slay you," said the Gael heavily and like a man speaking in a daze. "For the blood of brave men is on your head. Had you given the signal to charge sooner, some would have lived." Bran folded his arms. His eyes were haunted. Strike if you will. I am sick of slaughter. It is a cold mead, this kinging it. A king must gamble with men's lives and naked swords. The lives of all my people were at stake. I sacrificed the Northmen, yes, and my heart is sore within me, for they were men. But had I given the order when you would have desired, all might have gone awry. The Romans were not yet massed in the narrow mouth of the gorge, and might have had time and space to form their ranks again and beat us off. I waited until the last moment, and the rovers died. A king belongs to his people, and cannot let either his own feelings or the lives of men influence him. Now my people are saved, but my heart is cold in my breast. Cormac wearily dropped his sword point to the ground. You are a born king of men, Bran, said the Gaelic prince. Bran's eyes roved the field. A mist of blood hovered over all, where the victorious barbarians were looting the dead, while those Romans who had escaped slaughter by throwing down their swords and now stood under guard, looked on with hot smoldering eyes. My kingdom, my people, are saved, said Bran wearily. They will come from the heather by the thousands, and when Rome moves against us again, she will meet a solid nation. But I am weary. What of Cull? My eyes and brain were mazed with battle, answered Cormac. I thought to see him vanish like a ghost into the sunset. I will seek his body. Seek not for him, said Bran. Out of the sunrise he came, into the sunset he has gone. Out of the mists of the ages he came to us, and back into the mists of the eons has he returned, to his own kingdom. Cormac turned away. Night was gathering. Gonor stood like a white spectre before him. To his own kingdom, echoed the wizard. Time and space are not. Cull has returned to his own kingdom, his own crown, his own age. Then he was a ghost? Did you not feel the grip of his solid hand? Did you not hear his voice, see him eat and drink, laugh and slay and bleed? Still Cormac stood like one in a trance. Then if it be possible for a man to pass from one age into one yet unborn, or come forth from a century dead and forgotten, whichever you will, with his flesh and blood body and his arms, then he is as mortal as he was in his own day. Is Cull dead then? He died 100,000 years ago, as men reckon time, answered the wizard, but in his own age. He died not from the swords of the Gauls of this age. Have we not heard in legends how the king of Valusia traveled into a strange, timeless land of the misty future ages, and there fought in a great battle? Why, so he did. 100,000 years ago, or today. And 100,000 years ago, or a moment agone. Cull, king of Valusia, roused himself on the silken couch in his secret chamber and laughing, spoke to the first Gonor, saying, Ha, wizard, I have in truth dreamed strangely, for I went into a far clime and a far time in my visions, and fought for the king of a strange shadow people. And the great sorcerer smiled and pointed silently at the red, notched sword, and the torn mail and the many wounds that the king carried. And Cull, fully woken from his vision and feeling the sting and the weakness of these yet bleeding wounds, fell silent and mazed, and all life and time and space seemed like a dream of ghosts to him, and he wondered thereat all the rest of his life. For the wisdom of the eternities is denied even unto princes, and Cull could no more understand what Gonor told him than you can understand my words. And then Cull lived despite his many wounds, said Cormac, and has returned to the mists of silence and the centuries. Well, he thought us a dream, we thought him a ghost. And sure, life is but a web spun of ghosts and dreams and illusion, and it is in my mind that the kingdom which has this day been born of swords and slaughter in this howling valley is a thing no more solid than the foam of the bright sea. End of Kings of the Night. Exile of Atlantis. By Robert E. Howard. The sun was setting. A last crimson glory filled the land and lay like a crown of blood on the snow-sprinkled peaks. The three men who watched the death of the day breathed deep the fragrance of the early wind which stole up out of the distant forests, and then turned to a task more material. One of the men was cooking venison over a small fire, and this man, touching a finger to the smoking viand, tasted with the air of a connoisseur. "All ready, Kull, Gorna, let us eat." The speaker was young, little more than a boy. A tall, slim-waisted, broad-shouldered lad who moved with the easy grace of a leopard. Of his companions, one was an older man, a powerful, massively built hairy man, with an aggressive face. The other was a counterpart of the speaker, except for the fact that he was slightly larger, taller, a thought deeper of chest and broader of shoulder. He gave the impression, even more than the first youth, of dynamic speed concealed in long, smooth muscles. "Good," said he. "I am hungry." "When were you ever otherwise?" jeered the first speaker. "When I am fighting," Kull answered seriously. The other shot a quick glance at his friend as to fathom his inmost mind. He was not always sure of his friend. "And then you are blood-hungry," broke in the older man. "Mare, have done with your bantering and cut us food." Night began to fall, the stars blinked out. Over the shadowy hill country swept the dusk wind. Far off a tiger roared suddenly. Gorna made an instinctive motion toward the flint-pointed spear which lay beside him. Kull turned his head and a queer light flickered in his cold gray eyes. "The Striped Brothers hunt tonight," said he. "They worship the rising moon." Mare indicated the east where a red radiance was becoming evident. "Why?" asked Kull. "The moon discovers them to their prey and their enemies." "Once, many hundreds of years ago," said Gorna, "a king tiger, pursued by hunters, called on the woman in the moon and she flung him down a vine whereby he climbed to safety and abode for many years in the moon. Since then, all the striped people worship the moon." "I don't believe it," said Kull bluntly. "Why should the striped people worship the moon for aiding one of their race who died so long ago? Many a tiger has scrambled up Death Cliff and escaped the hunters, but they do not worship that cliff. How should they know what took place so long ago?" Gorna's brow clouded. "It little becomes you, Kull, to jeer at your elders or to mock the legends of your adopted people. This tale must be true because it has been handed down from generation unto generation longer than men remember. What always was, must always be." "I don't believe it," said Kull. "These mountains always were, but some day they will crumble and vanish. Some day the sea will flow over these hills." "Enough of this blasphemy," cried Gorna with a passion that was almost anger. "Kull, we are close friends and I bear with you because of your youth. But one thing you must learn: respect for tradition. You mock at the customs and ways of our people, you whom that people rescued from the wilderness and gave a home and a tribe." "I was a hairless ape roaming in the woods," admitted Kull frankly and without shame. "I could not speak the language of men and my only friends were the tigers and the wolves. I know not whom my people were, or what blood am I." "That matters not," broke in Gorna. "For all you have the aspect of one of that outlaw tribe who lived in Tiger Valley, and who perished in the Great Flood. It matters little. You have proven yourself a valiant warrior and a mighty hunter. Where will you find a youth to equal him in throwing the spear or in wrestling?" broke in Mare, his eyes alight. "Very true," said Gorna. "He is a credit to the Sea Mountain tribe, but for all that he must control his mouth, and learn to reverence the holy things of the past and of the present." "I mock not," said Kull without malice. "But many things the priests say I know to be lies, for I have run with the tigers and I know wild beasts better than the priests. Animals are either gods nor fiends, but men in their way without the lust and greed of man." "More blasphemy!" cried Gorna angrily. "Man is Valka's mightiest creation." Mare broke in to change the subject. "I heard the coast drums beating early in the morning. There is war on the sea. Volusia fights the Lemurian pirates." "Evil luck to both," grunted Gorna. Kull's eyes flickered again. "Volusia! Land of enchantment! Some day I will see the great city of wonder." "Evil the day that you do," snarled Gorna. "You will be loaded with chains with the doom of torture and death hanging over you. No man of our race sees the great city save as a slave, Evil luck attend her, muttered Aymare. Black luck and a red doom, exclaimed Gorna, shaking his fist toward the east. For each drop of spilt Atlantean blood, for each slave toiling in their cursed galleys, may a black blight rest on Valygia and all the 7 empires. Aymare, fired, leapt lightly to his feet and repeated part of the curse. Kull cut himself another slice of cooked meat. I have fought the Valysians, said he, and they were bravely arrayed but not hard to kill. Nor were they evil-featured. You fought the feeble guard of her northern coast, grunted Gorna, or the crew of stranded merchant ships. Wait until you have faced the charge of the black squadrons, or the great army as have I. Hi! Then there is blood to drink. With Gandero of the Spear, I harried the Valysian coasts when I was younger than you, Kull. Aye, we carried the torch and the sword deep into the empire. 500 men we were, of all the coast tribes of Atlantis. 4 of us returned. Outside the village of Hawks, which we burned and sacked, the van of the Black Squadron smote us. Hi, there the spears drank and the swords were eased of thirst. We slew and they slew, but when the thunder of battle was stilled, 4 of us escaped from the field, and all of us sore wounded. Ascalante tells me, pursued Kull, that the walls about the Crystal City are 10 times the height of a tall man, that the gleam of gold and silver would dazzle the eyes, and the women who throng the streets or lean from their windows are robed in strange, smooth robes that rustle and sheen. Ascalante should know, grimly said Gorna, since he was slave among them so long that he forgot his good Atlantean name, and must forsooth abide by the Valysian name they gave him. He escaped, commented Aymare. Aye, but for every slave that escapes the clutches of the 7 empires, 7 are rotting in dungeons and dying each day, for it was not meant for an Atlantean to bide as a slave. We have been enemies to the 7 empires since the dawn of time, mused Aymare. And will be until the world crashes, said Gorna with a savage satisfaction. For Atlantis, thank Valka, is the foe of all men. Aymare rose, taking his spear, and prepared to stand watch. The other 2 lay down on the sward and dropped asleep. Of what did Gorna dream? Battle perhaps, or the thunder of buffalo, or a girl of the caves. Kull, through the mists of his sleep echoed faintly and far away the golden melody of the trumpets. Clouds of radiant glory floated over him, then a mighty vista opened before his dream self. A great concourse of people stretched away into the distance, and a thunderous roar in a strange language went up from them. There was a minor note of steel clashing, and great shadowy armies reigned to the right and the left. The mist faded, and a face stood out boldly, a face above which hovered a regal crown, a hawk-like face, dispassionate, immobile, with eyes like the grey of the cold sea. Now the people thundered again. Hail the king! Hail the king! Kull the king! Kull awoke with a start. The moon glimmered on the distant mountain, the wind sighed through the tall grass. Gorna slept beside him, and Aymare stood, a naked bronze statue against the stars. Kull's eyes wandered to his scanty garment, a leopard's hide twisted about his pantherish loins. A naked barbarian, Kull's cold eyes glimmered. Kull the king! Again he slept. They arose in the morning and set out for the caves of the tribe. The sun was not yet high when the broad blue river met their gaze and the caverns of the tribe rose to view. Look! Aymare cried out sharply. They burned someone! A heavy stake stood before the caves. Thereon was a young girl bound. The people who stood about, hard-eyed, showed no sign of pity. Allah! Said Gorna, his face setting into unbending lines. She married a Lemurian pirate, the wanton. I, broke in a stony-eyed old woman. My own daughter, thus she brought shame on Atlantis. My daughter no longer. Her mate died, she was washed ashore when their ship was broken by the craft of Atlantis. Kull eyed the girl compassionately. He couldn't understand, why did these people, her own kin and blood, frown on her so, merely because she chose an enemy of her race? In all the eyes that were centered on her, Kull saw only one trace of sympathy. Amra's strange blue eyes were sad and compassionate. What Kull's own immobile face mirrored there is no knowing. But the eyes of the doomed girl rested on his. There was no fear in her fine eyes, but a deep and vibrant appeal. Kull's gaze wandered to the faggots at her feet. Soon the priest, who now chanted a curse beside her, would stoop and light these with the torch which he now held in his left hand. Kull saw that she was bound to the stake with a heavy wooden chain, a peculiar thing which was typically Atlantean in its manufacture. He could not sever that chain, even if he reached her through the throng that barred his way. Her eyes implored him. He glanced at the faggots, touched the long flint dagger at his girdle. She understood. Nodded, relief flooding her eyes. Kull struck as suddenly and unexpectedly as a cobra. He snatched the dagger from his girdle and threw it. Fairly under the heart it struck, killing her instantly. While the people stood spellbound, Kull wheeled, bounded away and ran up the sheer side of the cliff for 20 feet, like a cat. The people stood struck dumb, then a man whipped up bow and arrow and sighted along the smooth shaft. Kull was heaving himself over the lip of the cliff. The bowman's eyes narrowed. Amare, as if by accident, lurched headlong into him, and the arrow sang wide and aside. Then Kull was gone. He heard them screaming on his track, his own tribesmen, fired with the bloodlust, wild to run him down and slay him for violating their strange and bloody code of morals. But no man in Atlantis, and that means no man in the world, could foot it with Kull of the Sea Mountain tribe. End of Exile of Atlantis. The Striking of the Gong. By Robert E. Howard. Somewhere in the hot red darkness there began a throbbing. A pulsating cadence, soundless but vibrant with reality, sent out long rippling tendrils that flowed through the breathless air. The man stirred, groped about with blind hands and sat up. At first it seemed to him that he was floating on the even and regular waves of a black ocean, rising and falling with a monotonous regularity which hurt him physically somehow. He was aware of the pulsing and throbbing of the air, and he reached out his hands as though to catch the elusive waves. But was the throbbing in the air about him, or in the brain inside his skull? He could not understand, and a fantastic thought came to him, a feeling that he was locked inside his own skull. The pulsing dwindled, centralized, and he held his aching head in his hands and tried to remember. Remember what? This is a strange thing, he murmured. Who or what am I? What place is this? What has happened and why am I here? Have I always been here? He rose to his feet and sought to look about him. Utter darkness met his glance. He strained his eyes, but no single gleam of light met them. He began to walk forward, haltingly, hands out before him, seeking light as instinctively as a growing plant seeks it. This is surely not everything, he mused. There must be something else. What is different from this? Light. I know, I remember light, though I do not remember what light is. Surely I have known a different world than this. Far away a faint gray light began to glow. He hastened toward it. The gleam widened, until it was as if he were striding down a long and ever-widening corridor. Then he came out suddenly into dim starlight and felt the wind cold in his face. This is light, he murmured, but this is not all yet. He felt and recognized a sensation of terrific height. High above him, even with his eyes and below him, flashed and blazed great stars in a majestic glittering cosmic ocean. He frowned abstractedly as he gazed at these stars. Then he was aware that he was not alone. A tall vague shape loomed before him in the starlight. His hand shot instinctively to his left hip, then fell away limply. He was naked and no weapon hung at his side. The shape moved nearer, and he saw that it was a man, apparently a very ancient man, though the features were indistinct and elusive in the faint light. "You are new come here?" said this figure in a clear, deep voice which was much like the chiming of a jade gong. At the sound a sudden trickle of memory began in the brain of the man who heard the voice. He rubbed his chin in a bewildered manner. "Now I remember," said he. "I am Kull, king of Valusia. But what am I doing here? without garments or weapons. No man can bring anything through the door with him, said the other cryptically. Think, Cull of Valigia, know you not how you came? I was standing in the doorway of the council chamber, said Cull dazedly, and I remember that the watchman on the outer tower was striking the gong to denote the hour. Then suddenly the crash of the gong merged into a wild and sudden flood of shattering sound. All went dark and red sparks flashed for an instant before my eyes. Then I awoke in a cavern or a corridor of some sort, remembering nothing. You passed through the door, it always seems dark. Then I am dead? By Valka, some enemy must have been lurking among the columns of the palace and struck me down as I was speaking with Brule, the Pictish warrior. I have not said you were dead, answered the dim figure. Mayhap the door is not utterly closed. Such things have been. But what place is this? Is it paradise or hell? This is not the world I have known since birth. And those stars, I have never seen them before. Those constellations are mightier and more fiery than I ever knew in life. There are worlds beyond worlds, universes within and without universes, said the ancient. You are upon a different planet than that upon which you were born, you are in a different universe, doubtless in a different dimension. Then I am certainly dead. What is death but a traversing of eternities and a crossing of cosmic oceans? But I have not said that you are dead. Then where in Valka's name am I? Roared Cull, his short stock of patience exhausted. Your barbarian brain clutches at material actualities, answered the other tranquilly. What does it matter where you are, or whether you are dead, as you call it? You are a part of that great ocean which is life, which washes upon all shores, and you are as much a part of it in one place as in another, and as sure to eventually flow back to the source of it, which gave birth to all life. As for that, you are bound to life for all eternity as surely as a tree, a rock, a bird, or a world is bound. You call leaving your tiny planet, quitting your crude physical form, death. But I still have my body. I have not said that you are dead, as you name it. As for that, you may be still upon your little planet, as far as you know. Worlds within worlds, universes within universes. Things exist too small and too large for human comprehension. Each pebble on the beaches of Valigia contains countless universes within itself, and itself as a whole is as much a part of the great plan of all universes, as is the sun you know. Your universe, Cull of Valigia, may be a pebble on the shore of a mighty kingdom. You have broken the bounds of material limitations. You may be in a universe which goes to make up a gem on the robe you wore on Valigia's throne, or that universe you knew may be in the spiderweb which lies there on the grass near your feet. I tell you, size and space and time are relative and do not really exist. Surely you are a god, said Cull curiously. The mere accumulation of knowledge and the acquiring of wisdom does not make a god, answered the other rather impatiently. Look! A shadowy hand pointed to the great blazing gems which were the stars. Cull looked and saw that they were changing swiftly. A constant weaving, an incessant changing of design and pattern was taking place. The everlasting stars change in their own time, as swiftly as the races of men rise and fade. Even as we watch, upon those which are planets, beings are rising from the slime of the primeval, are climbing up the long slow roads to culture and wisdom, and are being destroyed with their dying worlds. All life and a part of life. To them it seems billions of years, to us, but a moment. All life. And a part of life. Cull watched fascinated, as huge stars and mighty constellations blazed and waned and faded, while others equally as radiant took their places, to be in turn supplanted. Then suddenly the hot red darkness flowed over him again, blotting out all the stars. As through a thick fog, he heard a faint familiar clashing. Then he was on his feet, reeling. Sunlight met his eyes, the tall marble pillars and walls of a palace, the wide curtained windows through which the sunlight flowed like molten gold. He passed a swift, dazed hand over his body, feeling his garments and the sword at his side. He was bloody, a red stream trickled down his temple from a shallow cut. but most of the blood on his limbs and clothing was not his. At his feet in a horrid crimson wallow lay what had been a man. The clashing he had heard ceased, re-echoing. Brule! What is this? What happened? Where have I been? You had nearly been on a journey to old King Death's realms, answered the Pict with a mirthless grin as he cleansed his sword. That spy was lying in wait behind a column and was on you like a leopard as you turned to speak to me in the doorway. Whoever plotted your death must have had great power to so send a man to his certain doom. Had not the sword turned in his hand and struck glancing instead of straight, you had gone before him with a cleft skull, instead of standing here now mulling over a mere flesh wound. But surely, said Cull, that was hours agone. Brule laughed. You are still mazed, Lord King. From the time he leaped and you fell, to the time I slashed the heart out of him, a man could not have counted the fingers of one hand. And during the time you were lying in his blood and yours on the floor, no more than twice that time elapsed. See, too has not yet arrived with bandages and he scurried for them the moment you went down. Aye, you are right, answered Cull. I cannot understand, but just before I was struck down I heard the gong sounding the hour, and it was still sounding when I came to myself. Brule, there is no such thing as time, nor space, for I have traveled the longest journey of my life, and have lived countless millions of years during the striking of the gong. End of the striking of the gong. The Altar and the Scorpion. By Robert E. Howard. God of the crawling darkness, grant me aid! A slim youth knelt in the gloom, his white body shimmering like ivory. The marble-polished floor was cold to his knees, but his heart was colder than the stone. High above him, merged into the masking shadows, loomed the great lapis lazuli ceiling, upheld by marble walls. Before him glimmered a golden altar, and on this altar shone a huge crystal image, a scorpion, wrought with a craft surpassing mere art. Great Scorpion, the boy continued his invocation, aid thy worshipper! Thou knowest how in bygone days, Gonra of the Sword, my greatest ancestor, died before thy shrine on a heap of slain barbarians who sought to defile thy holiness. Through the mouths of thy priests, thou promised aid to Gonra's race for all the years to come. Great Scorpion! Never has man or woman of my blood before reminded thee of thy vow. But now in my hour of bitter need I come before thee, to abjure thee to remember that oath, by the blood drunk by Gonra's blade, by the blood spilled from Gonra's veins. Great Scorpion! Guron, High Priest of the Black Shadow, is my enemy. Cull, King of all Volusia, rides from his purple-spired city to smite with fire and steel the priests who have defied him and still offer human sacrifice to the dark elder gods. But before the king may arrive and save us, I and the girl I love shall lie stark on the black altar in the temple of everlasting darkness. Guron has sworn he will give our soft bodies to ancient and abhorred abominations, and at last, our souls to the god that lurks forever in the black shadow. Cull sits high on the throne of Volusia, and now he rides to our aid, but Guron rules this mountain city, and even now he follows me. Great Scorpion, aid us! Remember Gonra, who gave up his life for you when the Atlantean savages carried the torch and sword into Volusia. The boy's slender form drooped, his head sank on his bosom despairingly. The great shimmering image on the altar gave back an icy sheen in the dim light, and no sign came to its worshipper, to show that the curious god had heard that passionate invocation. Suddenly the youth started erect. Quick steps throbbed on the long wide steps outside the temple. A girl darted into the shadowed doorway like a white flame blown before the wind. Guron, he comes! She gasped as she flew into her lover's arms. The boy's face went white and his embrace tightened as he gazed apprehensively at the doorway. Footfalls, heavy and sinister, clashed on the marble, and a shape of menace loomed in the opening. Guron the High Priest was a tall, gaunt man, a cadaverous giant. His evil eyes glimmered like fiery pools under his penthouse brows, and his thin gash of a mouth gaped in a silent laugh. His only garment was a silken loincloth, through which was thrust a cruel curved dagger, and he carried a short, heavy whip in his lean and powerful hand. His two victims clung to each other and gazed wide-eyed at their foe, as birds stare at a serpent. And Guron's slow, swaying stride as he advanced was not unlike the sinuous glide of a crawling snake. "Guron, have a care!" The youth spoke bravely, but his voice faltered from the fearful terror that gripped him. "If you have no fear of the king or pity for us, beware offending the great scorpion, under whose protection we are." Guron laughed in his might and arrogance. "The king!" he jeered. "What means the king to me, who am mightier than any king? The great scorpion? Ho! Ho! A forgotten god, a deity remembered only by children and women. Would you pit your scorpion against the Black Shadow? Fool! Valka himself, god of all gods, could not save you now. You are sworn to the god of the Black Shadow." He swept toward the cowering youngsters and gripped their white shoulders, sinking his talon-like nails deep into the soft flesh. They sought to resist, but he laughed and with incredible strength lifted them in the air, where he dangled them at arm's length, as a man might dangle a baby. His grating, metallic laughter filled the room with echoes of evil mockery. Then, holding the youth between his knees, he bound the girl hand and foot while she whimpered in his cruel clutch, then flinging her roughly to the floor, bound the youth likewise. Stepping back, he surveyed his work. The girl's frightened sobs sounded quick and panting in the silence. At last the high priest spoke. "Fools, to think to escape me! Always men of your blood, boy, have opposed me in council and court. Now you pay, and the Black Shadow drinks. Ho! Ho! I rule the city today, let he be king who may. My priests throng the streets, full armed, and no man dare say me nay. Were the king in the saddle this moment, he could not arrive and break my swordsman in time to save you." His eyes roved about the temple and fell upon the golden altar and the silent crystal scorpion. "Ho ho! What fools to pin your faith on a god whom men have long ceased to worship! Who has not even a priest to attend him, and who is granted a shrine only because of the memory of his former greatness, who is accorded reverence only by simple people and foolish women. The real gods are dark and bloody. Remember my words when soon you lie on an ebon altar behind which broods a black shadow forever. Before you die you shall know the real gods, the powerful, the terrible gods, who came from forgotten worlds and lost realms of blackness, who had their birth on frozen stars, and black suns brooding beyond the light of any stars. You shall know the brain-shattering truth of that unnameable one, to whose reality no earthly likeness may be given, but whose symbol is the Black Shadow." The girls ceased to cry, frozen, like the youth, in today's silence. They sensed, behind these threats, a hideous and inhuman gulf of monstrous shadows. Guron took a stride toward them, bent and reached claw-like hands to grip and lift them to his shoulders. He laughed as they sought to writhe away from him. His fingers closed on the girl's tender shoulder. A scream shattered the crystal gong of the silence into a million vibrating shards as Guron bounded into the air and fell on his face, screeching and writhing. Some small creature scurried away and vanished through the door. Guron's screams dwindled into a high, thin squealing and broke short at the highest note. Silence fell like a deathly mist. At last the boy spoke in an awed whisper. "What was it?" "A scorpion!" The girl's answer came low and tremulous. "It crawled across my bare bosom without harming me, and when Guron seized me, it stung him." Another silence fell. Then the boy spoke again, hesitantly. "No scorpion has been seen in this city for longer than men remember." "The Great One summoned this of his people to our aid," whispered the girl. "The gods never forget, and the great scorpion has kept his oath. Let us give thanks to him." And bound hand and foot as they were, the youthful lovers wriggled about on their faces where they lay giving praise to the great silent glistening scorpion on the altar for a long time, until a distant clash of many silver-shod hoofs and the clangor of swords bore them the coming of the king. End of the altar and the scorpion. By this axe I rule. By Robert E. Howard. 1. My songs are nails for a king's coffin. At midnight the king must die. The speaker was tall, lean and dark, and a crooked scar close to his mouth lent him an unusually sinister cast of countenance. His hearers nodded, their eyes glinting. There were 4 of these. One was a short, fat man, with a timid face, weak mouth and eyes which bulged in an air of perpetual curiosity. Another a great somber giant, hairy and primitive. The third a tall, wiry man in the garb of a jester whose flaming blue eyes flared with a light not wholly sane. And last a stocky dwarf of a man, inhumanly short and abnormally broad of shoulders and long of arms. The first speaker smiled in a wintry sort of manner. Let us take the vow, the oath that may not be broken, the oath of the dagger and the flame. I trust you, oh yes, of course. Still, it is better that there be assurance for all of us. I know tremors among some of you. That is all very well for you to say, Ascalante, broke in the short fat man. You are an ostracized outlaw anyway, with a price on your head. You have all to gain and nothing to lose, whereas we have much to lose and more to gain, answered the outlaw imperturbably. You called me down out of my mountain fastnesses to aid you in overthrowing a king. I have made the plans, set the snare, baited the trap, and stand ready to destroy the prey. But I must be sure of your support. Will you swear? Enough of this foolishness, cried the man with the blazing eyes. Aye, we will swear this dawn, and tonight we will dance down a king. Oh, the chant of the chariots and the whir of the wings of the vultures, save your songs for another time, Redondo, laughed Ascalante. This is a time for daggers, not rhymes. My songs are nails for a king's coffin, cried the minstrel, whipping out a long lean dagger. Varlets, bring hither a candle. I shall be first to swear the oath. A silent and somber slave brought a long taper, and Redondo pricked his wrist, bringing blood. One by one the other 4 followed his example, holding their wounded wrists carefully so that the blood should not drip yet. Then, gripping hands in a sort of circle, with the lighted candle in the center, they turned their wrists so that the blood drops fell upon it. While it hissed and sizzled, they repeated, I, Ascalante, a landless man, swear the deeds spoken and the silence covenanted, by the oath unbreakable. And I, Redondo, first minstrel of Valigia's courts, cried the minstrel. And I, Valmana, Count of Caraban, spoke the dwarf. And I, Gromel, commander of the Black Legion, rumbled the giant. And I, Canoa, Baron of Blael, quavered the short fat man, in a rather tremulous falsetto. The candle sputtered and went out, quenched by the ruby drops which fell upon it. So fade the life of our enemy, said Ascalante, releasing his comrade's hands. He looked on them with carefully veiled contempt. The outlaw knew that oaths may be broken, even unbreakable ones, but he knew also that Canoa, of whom he was most distrustful, was superstitious. There was no use overlooking any safeguard, no matter how slight. Tomorrow, said Ascalante abruptly. I mean today, for it is dawn now. Brule the spear-slayer, the king's right-hand man, departs from Gronder along with Kanu the Pictish ambassador, the Pictish escort, and a goodly number of the Red Slayers, the king's bodyguard. Yes, said Valmana with some satisfaction. That was your plan, Ascalante, but I accomplished it. I have kin high in the council of Gronder, and it was a simple matter to indirectly persuade the king of Gronder to request the presence of Kanu. And of course, as Kull honors Kanu above all others, he must have a sufficient escort. The outlaw nodded. Good. I have at last managed, through Gromel, to corrupt an officer of the Red Guard. This man will march his men away from the royal bedroom tonight just before midnight, on a pretext of investigating some suspicious noise or the like. The various sentries will have been disposed of. We will be waiting, we 5, and 16 desperate rogues of mine who I have summoned from the hills and who now hide in various parts of the city. 21 against 1. He laughed. Gromel nodded, Valmana grinned, Kanoa turned pale. Redondo smote his hands together and cried out ringingly. By Valka, they will remember this night, who strike the golden strings. The fall of the tyrant, the death of the despot, what songs I shall make. His eyes burned with a wild fanatical light, and the others regarded him dubiously, all save Ascalante, who bent his head to hide a grin. Then the outlaw rose suddenly. Enough! Get back to your places, and not by word, deed, or look do you betray what is in your minds. He hesitated, eyeing Kanoab. Baron, your white face will betray you. If Kull comes to you and looks into your eyes with those icy gray eyes of his, you will collapse. Get you out to your country estate and wait until we send for you. 4 are enough. Kanoab almost collapsed then, from a reaction of joy. He left babbling incoherencies. The rest nodded to the outlaw and departed. Ascalante stretched himself like a great cat and grinned. He called for a slave, and one came, a somber, evil-looking fellow whose shoulders bore the scars of the brand that marks thieves. Tomorrow, quoth Ascalante, taking the cup offered him, I come into the open and let the people of Valusia feast their eyes upon me. For months now, ever since the rebel force summoned me from my mountains, I have been cooped in like a rat, living in the very heart of my enemies, hiding away from the light in the daytime, skulking masked through dark alleys and darker corridors at night. Yet I have accomplished what those rebellious lords could not. Working through them and through other agents, many of whom have never seen my face, I have honeycombed the empire with discontent and corruption. I have bribed and subverted officials, spread sedition among the people. In short, I, working in the shadows, have paved the downfall of the king who at the moment sits throned in the sun. Ah, my friend, I had almost forgotten that I was a statesman before I was an outlaw, until Kanoab and Valmana sent for me. You work with strange comrades, said the slave. Weak men, but strong in their ways, lazily answered the outlaw. Valmana, a shrewd man, bold, audacious, with kin in high places, but poverty-stricken, and his barren estates loaded with debts. Gromel, a ferocious beast, strong and brave as a lion, with considerable influence among the soldiers, but otherwise useless, lacking the necessary brains. Kanoab, cunning in his low way and full of petty intrigue, but otherwise a fool and a coward, avaricious but possessed of immense wealth, which has been essential in my schemes. Redondo, a mad poet, full of harebrained schemes, brave but flighty. A prime favorite with the people because of his songs which tear out their heartstrings. He is our best bid for popularity, once we have achieved our design. I am the power that has welded these men, useless without me. Who mounts the throne, then? Kanoab, of course, or so he thinks. He has a trace of royal blood in him, the old dynasty, the blood of that king whom Kull killed with his bare hands. A bad mistake of the present king. He knows there are men who still boast descent from the old dynasty, but he lets them live. So Kanoab plots for the throne. Valmana wishes to be reinstated in favor, as he was under the old regime, so that he may lift his estate and title to their former grandeur. Gromel hates Kelka, commander of the Red Slayers, and thinks he should have that position. He wishes to be commander of all Valusia's armies. As to Redondo, bah! I despise the man and admire him at the same time. He is your true idealist. He sees in Kull, an outlander and a barbarian, merely a rough-footed, red-handed savage who has come out of the sea to invade a peaceful and pleasant land. He already idolizes the king Kull slew, forgetting the rogue's vile nature. He forgets the inhumanities under which the land groaned during his reign, and he is making the people forget. Already they sing the lament for the king in which Redondo lauds the saintly villain and vilifies Kull as that black-hearted savage. Kull laughs at these songs and indulges Redondo, but at the same time wonders why the people are turning against him. But why does Redondo hate Kull? Because he is a poet, and poets always hate those in power, and turn to dead ages for relief in dreams. Redondo is a flaming torch of idealism, and he sees himself as a hero, a stainless knight, which he is, rising to overthrow the tyrant. And you? Ascalante laughed and drained the goblet. I have ideas of my own. Poets are dangerous things, because they believe what they sing, at the time. Well, I believe what I think. And I think Kanuab will not hold the throne seat over long. A few months ago I had lost all ambition save to waste the villages and the caravans as long as I lived. Now we shall see. 2. Thene was the liberator now. A room strangely barren in contrast to the rich tapestries on the walls and the deep carpets on the floor. A small writing table, behind which sat a man. This man would have stood out in a crowd of 1,000,000. It was not so much because of his unusual size, his height and great shoulders, though these features lent to the general effect. But his face, dark and immobile, held the gaze, and his narrow gray eyes beat down the wills of the onlookers by their icy magnetism. Each movement he made, no matter how slight, betokened steel spring muscles and brain knit to those muscles with perfect coordination. There was nothing deliberate or measured about his motions. Either he was perfectly at rest, still as a bronze statue, or else he was in motion, with that cat-like quickness which blurred the sight that tried to follow his movements. Now this man rested his chin on his fists, his elbows on the writing table, and gloomily eyed the man who stood before him. This man was occupied in his own affairs at the moment, for he was tightening the laces of his breastplate. Moreover, he was abstractedly whistling, a strange and unconventional performance, considering that he was in the presence of a king. "Brule," said the king, "this matter of statecraft wearies me as all the fighting I have done never did." "A part of the game, Cull," answered Brule. "You are king, you must play the part." "I wish that I might ride with you to Gronder," said Cull enviously. "It seems ages since I had a horse between my knees, but Tu says that affairs at home require my presence. Curse him! Months and months ago," he continued with increasing gloom, getting no answer and speaking with freedom, "I overthrew the old dynasty and seized the throne of Valusia, of which I had dreamed ever since I was a boy in the land of my tribesmen. That was easy. Looking back now, over the long hard path I followed, all those days of toil, slaughter and tribulation seem like so many dreams. From a wild tribesman in Atlantis, I rose, passing through the galleys of Lemuria, a slave for 2 years at the oars, then an outlaw in the hills of Valusia, then a captive in her dungeons, a gladiator in her arenas, a soldier in her armies, a commander, a king. The trouble with me, Brule, I did not dream far enough. I always visualized merely the seizing of the throne. I did not look beyond. When King Borna lay dead beneath my feet, and I tore the crown from his gory head, I had reached the ultimate border of my dreams. From there, it has been a maze of illusions and mistakes. I prepared myself to seize the throne, not to hold it. When I overthrew Borna, then people hailed me wildly, then I was the liberator. Now they mutter and stare blackly behind my back. They spit at my shadow when they think I am not looking. They have put a statue of Borna, that dead swine, in the temple of the serpent, and people go and wail before him, hailing him as a saintly monarch who was done to death by a red-handed barbarian. When I led her armies to victory as a soldier, Valusia overlooked the fact that I was a foreigner. Now she cannot forgive me. And now, in the temple of the serpent, there come to burn incense to Borna's memory, men whom his executioners blinded and maimed, fathers whose sons died in his dungeons, husbands whose wives were dragged into his seraglio. Bah! Men are all fools. Redondo is largely responsible, answered the Pict, drawing his sword belt up another notch. He sings songs that make men mad. Hang him in his jester's garb to the highest tower in the city. Let him make rhymes for the vultures. Cull shook his lion head. No, Brule, he is beyond my reach. A great poet is greater than any king. He hates me, yet I would have his friendship. His songs are mightier than my scepter, for time and again he has near torn the heart from my breast when he chose to sing for me. I will die and be forgotten, his songs will live forever. The Pict shrugged his shoulders. As you like, you are still king, and the people cannot dislodge you. The Red Slayers are yours to a man, and you have all Pict land behind you. We are barbarians together, even if we have spent most of our lives in this land. I go now. You have naught to fear save an attempt at assassination, which is no fear at all, considering the fact that you are guarded night and day by a squad of the Red Slayers." Kull lifted his hand in a gesture of farewell, and the Pict clanked out the room. Now another man wished his attention, reminding Kull that a king's time was never his own. This man was a young noble of the city, one Sino Valdor. This famous young swordsman and reprobate presented himself before the king with the plain evidence of much mental perturbation. His velvet cap was rumpled, and as he dropped it to the floor when he kneeled, the plume drooped miserably. His gaudy clothing showed stains, as if in his mental agony he had neglected his personal appearance for some time. "King, Lord King," he said in tones of deep sincerity, "if the glorious record of my family means anything to your majesty, if my own fealty means anything, for Valka's sake, grant my request." "Name it." "Lord King, I love a maiden. Without her I cannot live. Without me, she must die. I cannot eat, I cannot sleep for thinking of her. Her beauty haunts me day and night, the radiant vision of her divine loveliness." Kull moved restlessly. He had never been a lover. "Then in Valka's name, marry her!" "Ah!" cried the youth. "There's the rub. She is a slave, Allah by name, belonging to one Valmana, Count of Caraban. It is on the black books of Valusian law that a noble cannot marry a slave. It has always been so. I have moved high heaven and get only the same reply. Noble and slave can never Wednesday, it is fearful. They tell me that never in the history of the empire before has a nobleman wanted to marry a slave. What is that to me? I appeal to you as a last resort. Will not this Valmana sell her?" "He would, but that would hardly alter the case. She would still be a slave, and a man cannot marry his own slave. Only as a wife I want her. Any other way would be hollow mockery. I want to show her to all the world, rigged out in the ermine and jewels of Valdor's wife. But it cannot be, unless you can help me. She was born a slave, of 100 generations of slaves, and slave she will be as long as she lives and her children after her. And as such she cannot marry a freeman." "Then go into slavery with her," suggested Kull, eyeing the youth narrowly. "This I desired," answered Sino, so frankly that Kull instantly believed him. "I went to Valmana and said, 'You have a slave whom I love. I wish to wed her. Take me, then, as your slave so that I may be ever near her.' He refused with horror. He would sell me the girl, or give her to me, but he would not consent to enslave me. And my father has sworn on the unbreakable oath to kill me if I should so degrade the name of Valdor as to go into slavery. No, Lord King, only you can help us." Kull summoned Tu and laid the case before him. Tu, chief counselor, shook his head. "It is written in the great iron-bound books, even as Sino has said. It has ever been the law, and it will always be the law. A noble may not mate with a slave." "Why may I not change that law?" queried Kull. Tu laid before him a tablet of stone whereon the law was engraved. "For thousands of years this law has been, see, Kull, on the stone it was carved by the primal lawmakers. So many centuries ago a man might count all night and still not number them all. Neither you, nor any other king, may alter it." Kull felt suddenly the sickening, weakening feeling of utter helplessness which had begun to assail him of late. Kingship was another form of slavery, it seemed to him. He had always won his way by carving a path through his enemies with his great sword. How could he prevail against solicitous and respectful friends who bowed and flattered and were adamant against anything new, or any change, who barricaded themselves and their customs with traditions and antiquity and quietly defied him to change anything? "Go," he said with a weary wave of his hand. "I am sorry, but I cannot help you." Sino Valdor wandered out of the room, a broken man, if hanging head and bent shoulders, dull eyes and dragging steps mean anything. 3. "I thought you a human tiger." A cool wind whispered through the green woodlands. A silver thread of a brook wound among great tree boles, whence hung large vines and gaily festooned creepers. A bird sang in the soft late summer sunlight was sifted through the interlocking branches to fall in gold and black velvet patterns of shade and light on the grass-covered earth. In the midst of this pastoral quietude, a little slave girl lay with her face between her soft white arms, and wept as if her little heart would break. The bird sang but she was deaf, the brook called her but she was dumb, the sun shone but she was blind, all the universe was a black void in which only pain and tears were real. So she did not hear the light footfall nor see the tall broad-shouldered man who came out of the bushes and stood above her. She was not aware of his presence until he knelt and lifted her, wiping her eyes with hands as gentle as a woman's. The little slave girl looked into a dark immobile face, with cold narrow gray eyes which just now were strangely soft. She knew this man was not of illusion from his appearance, and in these troublous times it was not a good thing for little slave girls to be caught in the lonely woods by strangers, especially foreigners, but she was too miserable to be afraid, and besides the man looked kind. "What's the matter, child?" he asked, and because a woman in extreme grief is likely to pour her sorrows out to anyone who shows interest and sympathy, she whimpered. "Oh, sir, I am a miserable girl. I love a young nobleman." "Sino Valdor?" "Yes, sir." She glanced at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "He wishes to marry me, and today, having striven in vain elsewhere for permission, he went to the king himself. But the king refused to aid him." A shadow crossed the stranger's dark face. "Did Sino say the king refused?" "No, the king summoned the chief counselor and argued with him a while, but gave in." "Oh," she sobbed, "I knew it would be useless. The laws of Valusia are unalterable. No matter how cruel or unjust, they are greater than the king." The girl felt the muscles of the arms supporting her swell and harden into great iron cables. Across the stranger's face passed a bleak and hopeless expression. He muttered, half to himself. "The laws of Valusia are greater than the king." Telling her troubles had helped her a little, and she dried her eyes. Little slave girls are used to troubles and to suffering, though this one had been unusually kindly used all her life. "Does Sino hate the king?" asked the stranger. She shook her head. "He realizes the king is helpless. And you?" "And I what?" "Do you hate the king?" Her eyes flared, shocked. "Oh, sir, who am I to hate the king? Why, I never thought of such a thing." "I am glad," said the man heavily. "After all, little one, the king is only a slave like yourself, locked with heavier chains." "Poor man," she said, pityingly though not exactly understanding, then she flamed into wrath. "But I do hate the cruel laws which the people follow. Why should laws not change? Time never stands still. Why should people today be shackled by laws which were made for our barbarian ancestors thousands of years ago?" She stopped suddenly and looked fearfully about. "Don't tell," she whispered, laying her head in an appealing manner on her companion's iron shoulder. "It is not fit that a woman, and a slave girl at that, should so unashamedly express herself on such public matters. I will be spanked if my mistress or my master hears of it." The big man smiled. "Be at ease, child. The king himself would not be offended at your sentiments. Indeed, I believe that he agrees with you." "Have you seen the king?" she asked, her childish curiosity overcoming her misery for the moment. "Often." "And is he 8 feet tall?" she asked eagerly. "And has he horns under his crown, as the common people say?" "Scarcely," he laughed. "He lacks nearly 2 feet of answering your description as regards height. As for size, he might be my twin brother. There is not an inch difference in us. Is he as kind as you?" "At times, when he is not goaded to frenzy by a statecraft which he cannot understand and by the vagaries of a people which can never understand him." "Is he in truth a barbarian?" "In very truth. He was born and spent his early boyhood among the heathen barbarians who inhabit the land of Atlantis. He dreamed a dream and fulfilled it. Because he was a great fighter and a savage swordsman, because he was crafty in actual battle, because the barbarian mercenaries and Valusian armies loved him, he became king. Because he is a warrior and not a politician, because his swordsmanship helps him now not at all, his throne is rocking beneath him. And he is very unhappy. Not all the time, smiled the big man. Sometimes when he slips away alone and takes a few hours' holiday by himself among the woods, he is almost happy. Especially when he meets a pretty girl like. The girl cried out in sudden terror, slipping to her knees before him. "Oh, sire, sire, have mercy! I did not know, you are the king!" "Don't be afraid." Kull knelt beside her again and put an arm about her, feeling her trembling from head to foot. "You said I was kind?" "And so you are, sire," she whispered weakly. I thought you were a human tiger, from what men said, but you are kind and tender, but you are king and I. Suddenly, in a very agony of confusion and embarrassment, she sprang up and fled, vanishing instantly. The overcoming realization that the king, whom she had only dreamed of seeing at a distance some day, was actually the man to whom she had told her pitiful woes, overcame her and filled her with an abasement and embarrassment which was an almost physical terror. Kull sighed and rose. The affairs of the palace were calling him back, and he must return and wrestle with problems concerning the nature of which he had only the vaguest idea and concerning the solving of which he had no idea at all. 4. Who dies first? Through the utter silence which shrouded the corridors and halls of the palace, 20 figures stole. Their stealthy feet, cased in soft leather shoes, made no sound either on thick carpet or bare marble tile. The torches which stood in niches along the halls gleamed redly on bared dagger, broad sword blade and keen-edged axe. "Easy, easy all," hissed Ascalante, halting for a moment to glance back at his followers. "Stop that cursed loud breathing, whoever it is. The officer of the night guard has removed all the guards from these halls, either by direct order or by making them drunk, but we must be careful. Lucky it is for us that those cursed pigs, the lean wolves, are either reveling at the consulate or riding to Gronder. Hist! Back, here come the guard." They crowded back behind a huge pillar which might have hidden a whole regiment of men, and waited. Almost immediately 10 men swung by, tall brawny men, in red armor, who looked like iron statues. They were heavily armed and the faces of some showed a slight uncertainty. The officer who led them was rather pale. His face was set in hard lines and he lifted a hand to wipe sweat from his brow as the guard passed the pillar where the assassins hid. He was young and this betraying of a king came not easy to him. They clanked by and passed on up the corridor. "Good!" chuckled Ascalante. "He did as I bid. Kull sleeps unguarded. Haste, we have work to do. If they catch us killing him, we are undone, but a dead king is easy to make a mere memory. Haste! I haste!" cried Redondo. They hurried down the corridor with reckless speed and stopped before a door. "Here!" snapped Ascalante. "Gromel, break me open this door!" The giant launched his mighty weight against the panel. Again, this time there was a rending of bolts, a crash of wood, and the door staggered and burst inward. "In!" shouted Ascalante, on fire with the spirit of murder. "In!" roared Redondo. "Death to the tyrant!" They halted short. Kull faced them, not a naked Kull, roused out of deep sleep, mazed and unarmed to be butchered like a sheep, but a Kull wakeful and ferocious, partly clad in the armor of a red slayer, with a long sword in his hand. Kull had risen quietly a few minutes before, unable to sleep. He had intended to ask the officer of the guard into his room to converse with him a while, but on looking through the spy-hole of the door, had seen him leading his men off. To the suspicious brain of the barbarian king had leaped the assumption that he was being betrayed. He never thought of calling the men back, because they were supposedly in the plot too. There was no good reason for this desertion. So Kull had quietly and quickly donned the armor he kept at hand, nor had he completed this act when Gromel first hurtled against the door. For a moment the tableau held, the 4 rebel noblemen at the door and the 10 wild desperate outlaws crowding close behind them, held at bay by the terrible-eyed silent giant who stood in the middle of the royal bedroom, sword at the ready. Then Ascalante shouted, "In! And slay him! He is 1 to 20, and he has no helmet!" True, there had been lack of time to put on the helmet, nor was there now time to snatch the great shield from where it hung on the wall. Be that as it may, Kull was better protected than any of the assassins except Gromel and Val Manna, who were in full armor, with their visors closed. With a yell that rang to the roof, the killers flooded into the room. First of all was Gromel. He came in like a charging bull, head down, sword low for the disemboweling thrust. And Kull sprang to meet him like a tiger charging a bull, and all the king's weight and mighty strength went into the arm that swung the sword. In a whistling arc the great blade flashed through the air to crash down on the commander's helmet. Blade and helmet clashed and flew to pieces together, and Gromel rolled lifeless on the floor, while Kull bounded back, gripping the bladeless hilt. "Gromel!" he snarled as the shattered helmet disclosed the shattered head. Then the rest of the pack were upon him. He felt the dagger point rake along his ribs and flung the wielder aside with a swing of his great left arm. He smashed his broken hilt square between another's eyes and dropped him senseless and bleeding to the floor. "Watch the door, 4 of you!" screamed Ascalante, dancing about the edge of that whirlpool of singing steel, for he feared Kull, with his great weight and speed, might smash through their midst and escape. 4 rogues drew back and ranged themselves before the single door. And in that instant Kull leaped to the wall and tore therefrom an ancient battle axe which had hung there for possibly 100 years. Back to the wall he faced them for a moment, then leaped among them. No defensive fighter was Kull. He always carried the fight to the enemy. A sweep of the axe dropped an outlaw to the floor with a severed shoulder. The terrible backhand stroke crushed the skull of another. A sword shattered against his breastplate, else he had died. His concern was to protect his uncovered head and the spaces between breastplate and backplate, for Valysian armor was intricate, and he had had no time to fully arm himself. Already he was bleeding from wounds on the cheek and the arms and legs, but so swift and deadly he was, and so much the fighter that even with the odds so greatly on their side, the assassins hesitated to leave an opening. Moreover, their own numbers hampered them. For one moment they crowded him savagely, raining blows, then they gave back and ringed him, thrusting and parrying. A couple of corpses on the floor gave mute evidence of the unwisdom of their first plan. "Knaves!" screamed Redondo in a rage, flinging off his slouch cap, his wild eyes glaring. "Do ye shrink from the combat? Shall the despot live? Out on it!" He rushed in, thrusting viciously, but Kull, recognizing him, shattered his sword with a tremendous short chop and, with a push, sent him reeling back to sprawl on the floor. The king took in his left arm the sword of Ascalante, and the outlaw only saved his life by ducking Kull's axe and bounding backward. One of the hairy bandits dived at Kull's legs hoping to bring him down in that manner, but after wrestling for a brief instant at what seemed a solid iron tower, he glanced up just in time to see the axe falling, but not in time to avoid it. In the interim one of his comrades had lifted a sword with both hands and hewed downward with such downright sincerity that he cut through Kull's shoulder plate on the left side, and wounded the shoulder beneath. In an instant the king's breastplate was full of blood. Val Manna, flinging the attackers to right and left in his savage impatience, came plowing through and hacked savagely at Kull's unprotected head. Kull ducked and the sword whistled above, shaving off a lock of hair. Ducking the blows of a dwarf like Val Manna is difficult for a man of Kull's height. Kull pivoted on his heel and struck from the side, as a wolf might leap, in a wide level arc. Val Manna dropped with his whole left side caved in and the lungs gushing forth. "Val Manna!" Kull spoke the word rather breathlessly. "I'd know that dwarf in hell." He straightened to defend himself from the maddened rush of Redondo, who charged in wild and wide open, armed only with a dagger. Kull leaped back, axe high. "Redondo!" His voice rang sharply. Back! I would not harm you. Die, tyrant! Screamed the mad minstrel, hurling himself headlong on the king. Kull delayed the blow he was loath to deliver until it was too late. Only when he felt the bite of steel in his unprotected side did he strike, in a frenzy of blind desperation. Redondo dropped with a shattered skull and Kull reeled back against the wall, blood spurting through the fingers which gripped his wounded side. In now, and get him! Yelled Ascalante, preparing to lead the attack. Kull placed his back to the wall and lifted his axe. He made a terrible and primordial picture. Legs braced far apart, head thrust forward, one red hand clutching at the wall for support, the other gripping the axe on high, while the ferocious features were frozen in a death snarl of hate, and the icy eyes blazed through the mist of blood which veiled them. The men hesitated. The tiger might be dying, but he was still capable of dealing death. Who dies first? Snarled Kull through smashed and bloody lips. Ascalante leaped as a wolf leaps, halted almost in midair with the unbelievable speed which characterized him, and fell prostrate to avoid the death that was hissing toward him in the form of a red axe. He frantically whirled his feet out of the way and rolled clear just as Kull recovered from his missed blow and struck again. This time the axe sank 4 inches into the polished wood floor close to Ascalante's revolving legs. Another desperado rushed at this instant, followed half-heartedly by his fellows. The first villain had figured on reaching Kull and killing him before he could get his axe out of the floor, but he miscalculated the king's speed, or else he started his rush a second too late. At any rate, the axe lurched up and crashed down, and the rush halted abruptly as a reddened caricature of a man was catapulted back against their legs. At that moment a hurried clanking of feet sounded down the hall, and the rogues in the door raised a shout. "Soldiers coming!" Ascalante cursed, and his men deserted him like rats leaving a sinking ship. They rushed out into the hall, or limped, splattering blood, and down the corridor a hue and cry was raised, and pursuit started. Save for the dead and dying men on the floor, Kull and Ascalante stood alone in the royal bedroom. Kull's knees were buckling and he leaned heavily against the wall, watching the outlaw with the eyes of a dying wolf. "All seems to be lost, particularly honor," he murmured. "However, the king is dying on his feet, and whatever other cogitation might have passed through his mind is not known, for at that moment he ran lightly at Kull just as the king was employing his axe arm to wipe the blood from his half-blind eyes. A man with a sword at the ready can thrust quicker than a wounded man out of position can strike with an axe that weighs his weary arm like lead. But even as Ascalante began his thrust, Sino Valdor appeared at the door and flung something through the air which glittered, sang, and ended its flight in Ascalante's throat. The outlaw staggered, dropped his sword, and sank to the floor at Kull's feet, flooding them with the flow of a severed jugular, mute witness that Sino's war skill included knife-throwing as well. Kull looked down bewilderedly at the dead outlaw, and Ascalante's dead eyes stared back in seeming mockery, as if the owner still maintained the futility of kings and outlaws, of plots and counterplots. Then Sino was supporting the king. The room was flooded with men-at-arms in the uniform of the great Valdor family, and Kull realized that a little slave girl was holding his other arm. Kull, are you dead?" Valdor's face was very white. "Not yet," the king spoke huskily. "Staunch this wound in my left side. If I die 'twill be from it. 'Tis deep, but the rest are not mortal. Redondo wrote me a deathly song there. Cram stuff into it for the present. I have work to do." They obeyed wonderingly, and as the flow of blood ceased, Kull, though literally bled white already, felt some slight access of strength. The palace was fully aroused now. Court ladies, lords, men-at-arms, counselors, all swarmed about the place babbling. The Red Slayers were gathering, wild with rage, ready for anything, jealous of the fact that others had aided their king. Of the young officer who had commanded the door guard, he had slipped away in the darkness, and neither then nor later was he in evidence, though earnestly sought after. Kull, still keeping stubbornly to his feet, grasping his bloody axe with one hand and Sino's shoulder with another, singled out two, who stood wringing his hands, and ordered, Bring me the tablet whereon is engraved the law concerning slaves. But Lord King! Do as I say, howled Kull, lifting the axe, and two scurried to obey. As he waited and the court women flocked about him, dressing his wounds and trying gently but vainly to pry his iron fingers from about the bloody axe handle, Kull heard Sino's breathless tale. Allah heard Kanuab and Valmana plotting. She had stolen into a little nook to cry over her, our troubles, and Kanuab came, on his way to his country estate. He was shaking with terror for fear plans might go awry, and he made Valmana go over the plot with him again before he left, so he might know there was no flaw in it. He did not leave until it was late, and then Allah stole away and came to me. But it is a long way from Valmana's city house to the house of Valdor, a long way for a little girl to walk, and though I gathered my men and came instantly, we almost arrived too late. Kull gripped his shoulder. I will not forget. Two entered with the law tablet, laying it reverently on the table. Kull shouldered aside all who stood near him, and stood up alone. Here, people of Valusia, he exclaimed, upheld by the wild beast vitality which was his, fired from within by a strength which was more than physical. I stand here, the king. I am wounded almost unto death, but I have survived mass wounds. Hear you! I am weary of this business. I am no king but a slave. I am hemmed in by laws. I cannot punish malefactors nor reward my friends because of law, custom, tradition. By Valka, I will be king in fact as well as in name. Here stand the two who have saved my life. Henceforward they are free to marry, to do as they like. Sino and Allah rushed into each other's arms with a glad cry. But the law! Screamed Tuesday. I am the law! Roared Kull, swinging up his axe. It flashed downward and the stone tablet flew into 100 pieces. The people clenched their hands in horror, waiting dumbly for the sky to fall. Kull reeled back, eyes blazing. The room whirled to his dizzy gaze. I am king, state and law! He roared, and seizing the wand-like scepter which lay near, he broke it in two and flung it from him. This shall be my scepter! The red axe was brandished aloft, splashing the pallid nobles with drops of blood. Kull gripped the slender crown with his left hand and placed his back against the wall. Only that support kept him from falling, but in his arms was still the strength of lions. I am either king or corpse! He roared, his corded muscles bulging, his terrible eyes blazing. If you like not my kingship, come and take this crown! The corded left arm held out the crown, the right gripping the menacing axe above it. By this axe I rule. This is my scepter. I have struggled and sweated to be the puppet king you wished me to be, to king it your way. Now I use mine own way. If you will not fight, you shall obey. Laws that are just shall stand. Laws that have outlived their times I shall shatter as I shattered that one. I am king. Slowly the pale-faced noblemen and frightened women knelt, bowing in fear and reverence to the blood-stained giant who towered above them with his eyes ablaze. I am king! End of the Altar and the Scorpion. The Cat and the Skull. By Robert E. Howard. King Kull went with Tu, chief counselor of the throne, to see the talking cat of Delcards, for though a cat may look at a king, it is not given every king to look at a cat like Delcards. So Kull forgot the death threat of Thulsa Doom the necromancer, and went to Delcards. Kull was skeptical and Tu was wary and suspicious without knowing why, but years of counterplot and intrigue had soured him. He swore testily that a talking cat was a snare and a fraud, a swindle and a delusion, and maintained that should such a thing exist, it was a direct insult to the gods, who ordained that only man should enjoy the power of speech. But Kull knew that in the old times beasts had talked to men, for he had heard the legends, handed down from his barbarian ancestors. So he was skeptical but open to conviction. Delcards helped the conviction. She lounged with supple ease upon her silk couch, herself like a great beautiful feline, and looked at Kull from under long drooping lashes, which lended unimaginable charm to her narrow, piquantly slanted eyes. Her lips were full and red unusually, as at present, curved in a faint enigmatical smile, and her silken garments, and ornaments of gold and gems hid little of her glorious figure. But Kull was not interested in women. He ruled Volusia, but for all that he was an Atlantean and a ferocious savage in the eyes of his subjects. War and conquest held his attention, together with keeping his feet on the ever-rocking throne of the ancient empire, and the task of learning the ways, customs, and thoughts of the people he ruled, and the threats of Thulsa Doom. To Kull, Delcartes was a mysterious and queenly figure, alluring, yet surrounded by a haze of ancient wisdom and womanly magic. To Tu, chief counselor, she was a woman and therefore the latent base of intrigue and danger. To Kanu, Pictish ambassador and Kull's closest advisor, she was an eager child, parading under the effect of her show acting. But Kanu was not there when Kull came to see the talking cat. The cat lolled on a silken cushion, on a couch of her own, and surveyed the king with inscrutable eyes. Her name was Serums, and she had a slave who stood behind her, ready to do her bidding, a lanky man who kept the lower part of his face half concealed by a thin veil which fell to his chest. "King Kull," said Delcartes, "I crave a boon of you, before Serums begins to speak, when I must be silent." "You may speak," Kull answered. The girl smiled eagerly, and clasped her hands. "Let me marry Kulratum of Zarfanana!" Tu broke in as Kull was about to speak. "My lord, this matter has been thrashed out at lengths before. I thought there was some purpose in requesting this visit. This girl has a strain of royal blood in her, and it is against the custom of Volusia that royal women should marry foreigners of lower rank." "But the king can rule otherwise," pouted Delcartes. "My lord," said Tu, spreading his hands as one in the last stages of nervous irritation, "if she marries thus, it is like to cause war and rebellion and discord for the next 100 years. He was about to plunge into a dissertation on rank, genealogy, and history, but Kull interrupted, his short stock of patience exhausted. "Valka and Hotath! Am I an old woman or a priest to be bedeviled with such affairs? Settle it between yourselves and vex me no more with questions of mating. By Valka, in Atlantis men and women marry whom they please and none else." Delcartes pouted a little, made a face at Tu who scowled back, then smiled sunnily and turned on her couch with a lissom movement. "Talk to Serums, Kull, she will grow jealous of me." Kull eyed the cat uncertainly. Her fur was long, silky and gray, her eyes slanting and mysterious. "She is very young, Kull, yet she is very old," said Delcartes. "She is a cat of the old race who lived to be thousands of years old. Ask her age, Kull." "How many years have you seen, Serums?" asked Kull idly. "Volusia was young when I was old," the cat answered in a clear though curiously timbred voice. Kull started violently. "Valka and Hotath!" he swore. "She talks!" Delcartes laughed softly in pure enjoyment, but the expression of the cat never altered. "I talk, I think I know I am," she said. "I have been the ally of queens and the counselor of kings ages before even the white beaches of Atlantis knew your feet, Kull of Volusia. I saw the ancestors of the Volusians ride out of the Far East to trample down the old race, and I was here when the old race came up out of the ocean so many eons ago that the mind of man reels when seeking to measure them. Older am I than Thulsa Doom, whom few men have ever seen. I have seen empires rise and kingdoms fall and kings ride in on their steeds and out on their shields. I have been a goddess in my time, and strange were the neophytes who bowed before me, and terrible were the rites which were performed in my worship to pleasure me. For of Eld beings exalted my kind, beings as strange as their deeds." "Can you read the stars and foretell events?" Kull's barbarian mind leaped at once to material ideas. "Aye, the books of the past and the future are open to me, and I tell man what is good for him to know." "Then tell me," said Kull, "where I misplaced the secret letter from Kanu yesterday." "You thrust it into the bottom of your dagger scabbard and then instantly forgot it," the cat replied. Kull started, snatched out his dagger, and shook the sheath. A thin strip of folded parchment tumbled out. "Valka and Hotath!" he swore. "Sairms, you are a witch of cats! Mark ye, too!" But Tu's lips were pressed in a straight disapproving line, and he eyed Delcards darkly. She returned his stare guilelessly, and he turned to Kull in irritation. "My lord, consider! This is all mummery of some sort. None saw me hide that letter, for I myself had forgotten." "Lord King, any spy might." "Spy? Be not a greater fool than you were born. Tuesday shall a cat set spies to watch me hide letters?" Tu sighed. As he grew older, it was becoming increasingly difficult to refrain from showing exasperation toward kings. "My lord, give thought to the humans who may be behind the cat." "Lord Tu," said Delcards in a tone of gentle reproach, "you put me to shame and you offend Sairms." Kull felt vaguely angered at Tuesday. "At least, Tu," said he, "the cat talks, that you cannot deny." "There is some trickery," Tu stubbornly maintained. "Man talks, beasts may not." "Not so," said Kull, himself convinced of the reality of the talking cat and anxious to prove the rightness of his belief. "A lion talked to Cambra, and birds have spoken to the old men of the sea mountain tribes, telling them where game was hidden. None denies that beasts talk among themselves. Many a night have I lain on the slopes of the forest-covered hills or out on the grassy savannas and have heard the tigers roaring to one another across the starlight. Then why should some beast not learn the speech of man? There have been times when I could almost understand the roaring of the tigers. The tiger is my totem and is taboo to me save in self-defense," he added irrelevantly. Tu squirmed. This talk of totem and taboo was good enough in a savage chief, but to hear such remarks from the king of Valysia irked him extremely. "My lord," said he, "a cat is not a tiger." "Very true," said Kull, "and this one is wiser than all tigers." "That is naught but truth," said Sairms calmly. "Lord Chancellor, would you believe then, if I told you what was at this moment transpiring at the royal treasury?" "No," Tu snarled. "Clever spies may learn anything, as I have found." "No man can be convinced when he will not," said Sairms imperturbably, quoting a very old Valysian saying. "Yet know, Lord Tu, that a surplus of 20 gold tals has been discovered, and a courier is even now hastening through the streets to tell you of it. Ah," as the steps sounded in the corridor without, "even now he comes." A slim courtier, clad in the gay garments of the royal treasury, entered, bowing deeply, and craved permission to speak. Kull having granted it, he said, "Mighty King and Lord Tu, a surplus of 20 tals of gold has been found in the royal moneys." Delcards laughed and clapped her hands delightedly, but Tu merely scowled. "When was this discovered?" "A scant half-hour ago." "How many have been told of it?" "None, my lord. Only I and the royal treasurer have known until just now, when I told you, my lord." "Humph!" Tu waved him aside sourly. "Begone. I will see about this matter later." "Delcards," said Kull, "this cat is yours, is she not?" "Lord King," answered the girl, "no one owns Sairms. She only bestows on me the honor of her presence. She is a guest. As for the rest, she is her own mistress and has been for 1,000 years. I would that I might keep her in the palace," said Kull. "Sairms," said Delcards deferentially, "the king would have you as his guest." "I will go with the king of Valysia," said the cat with dignity, "and remain in the royal palace until such time as it shall pleasure me to go elsewhere. For I am a great traveler, Kull, and it pleases me at times to go out over the world path and walk the streets of cities where in ages gone I have roamed forests, and to tread the sands of deserts where long ago I trod imperial streets." So Sairms the talking cat came to the royal palace of Valysia. Her slave accompanied her, and she was given a spacious chamber, lined with fine couches and silken pillows. The best viands of the royal table were placed before her daily, and all the household of the king did homage to her except two who grumbled to see a cat exalted, even a talking cat. Cerums treated him with amused contempt but admitted Cull into a level of dignified equality. She quite often came into his throne chamber, borne on a silken cushion by her slave who must always accompany her, no matter where she went. At other times Cull came into her chamber, and they talked into the dim hours of dawn, and many were the tales she told him and ancient the wisdom that she imparted. Cull listened with interest and attention, for it was evident that this cat was wiser far than many of his counselors, and had gained more antique wisdom than all of them together. Her words were pithy and oracular, and she refused to prophesy beyond minor affairs taking place in the everyday life of the palace and kingdom, save that she warned him against Thulsadum, who had sent a threat to Cull. "For," said she, "I who have lived more years than you shall live minutes, know that man is better without knowledge of things to come, for what is to be will be, and man can neither avert nor hasten. It is better to go in the dark when the road must pass a lion and there is no other road." "Yet," said Cull, "if what must be is to be, a thing which I doubt, and a man be told what things shall come to pass and his arm weakened or strengthened thereby, then was not that too foreordained?" "If he was ordained to be told," said Cerums, adding to Cull's perplexity and doubt. "However, not all of life's roads are set fast, for a man may do this or a man may do that, and not even the gods know the mind of a man." "Then," said Cull dubiously, "all things are not destined, if there be more than one road for a man to follow. And how can events then be prophesied truly?" "Life has many roads, Cull," answered Cerums. "I stand at the crossroads of the world, and I know what lies down each road. Still, not even the gods know what road a man will take, whether the right hand or the left hand, when he comes to the dividing of the ways, and once started upon a road he cannot retrace his steps." "Then, in Valka's name," said Cull, "why not point out to me the perils or the advantages of each road as it comes and aid me in choosing?" "Because there are bounds set upon the powers of such as I," the cat replied, "lest we hinder the workings of the alchemy of the gods. We may not brush the veil entirely aside for human eyes, lest the gods take our power from us and lest we do harm to man. For though there are many roads at each crossroads, still a man must take one of those, and sometimes one is no better than another. So hope flickers her lamp along one road and man follows, though that road may be the foulest of all." Then she continued, seeing Cull found it difficult to understand. "You see, Lord King, that our powers must have limits, else we might grow too powerful and threaten the gods. So a mystic spell is laid upon us, and while we may open the books of the past, we may but grant flying glances of the future, through the mist that veils it." Cull felt somehow that the argument of Cerums was rather flimsy and illogical, smacking of witchcraft and mummery. But with Cerums' cold, oblique eyes gazing unwinkingly at him, he was not prone to offer any objections, even had he thought of any. "No," said the cat, "I will draw aside the veil for an instant to your own good. Let Delcartes marry Coloratum." Cull rose with an impatient twitch of his mighty shoulders. "I will have naught to do with a woman's mating. Let two attend to it." Yet Cull slept on the thought, and as Cerums wove the advice craftily into her philosophizing and moralizing in days to come, Cull weakened. A strange sight it was, indeed, to see Cull, his chin resting on his great fist, leaning forward and drinking in the distinct intonations of the cat Cerums as she lay curled on her silken cushion, or stretched languidly at full length, as she talked of mysterious and fascinating subjects, her eyes glinting strangely and her lips scarcely moving, or not at all, while the slave Cthulhu stood behind her like a statue, motionless and speechless. Cull highly valued her opinions, and he was prone to ask her advice, which she gave warily or not at all, on matters of state. Still, Cull found that what she advised usually coincided with his private wishes, and he began to wonder if she were not a mind-reader also. Cthulhu irked him with his gauntness, his motionlessness, and his silence, but Cerums would have none other to attend her. Kull strove to pierce the veil that masked the man's features, but though it seemed thin enough, he could tell nothing of the face beneath, and out of courtesy to Sairms, never asked Cthulhu to unveil. Kull came to the chamber of Sairms one day, and she looked at him with enigmatical eyes. The masked slave stood statue-like behind her. "Kull," said she, "again I will tear the veil for you. Brule, the Pictish spear-slayer, warrior of Cthulhu and your friend, has just been haled beneath the surface of the Forbidden Lake by a grisly monster." Kull sprang up, cursing in rage and alarm. "Ha, Brule? Valka's name, what was he doing about the Forbidden Lake?" "He was swimming there. Hasten, you may yet save him, even though he be borne to the enchanted land which lies below the lake." Kull whirled toward the door. He was startled, but not so much as he would have been had the swimmer been someone else, for he knew the reckless irreverence of the Pict, chief among Valusia's most powerful allies. He started to shout for guards when Sairm's voice stayed him. "Nay, my lord. You had best go alone. Not even your command might make men accompany you into the waters of that grim lake, and by the custom of Valusia, it is death for any man to enter there save the king." I will go alone," said Kull, "and thus save Brule from the anger of the people, should he chance to escape the monsters. Inform Cthulhu." Kull, discouraging respectful inquiries with wordless snarls, mounted his great stallion and rode out of Valusia at full speed. He rode alone, and he ordered none to follow him. That which he had to do, he could do alone, and he did not wish anyone to see when he brought Brule or Brule's corpse out of the Forbidden Lake. He cursed the reckless inconsideration of the Pict, and he cursed the taboo which hung over the lake, the violation of which might cause rebellion among the Valusians. Twilight was stealing down from the mountains of Zalgara when Kull halted his horse on the shores of the lake that lay amid a great lonely forest. There was certainly nothing forbidding in its appearance, for its waters spread blue and placid from beach to wide white beach, and the tiny islands rising above its bosom seemed like gems of emerald and jade. A faint shimmering mist rose from it, enhancing the air of lazy unreality which lay about the regions of the lake. Kull listened intently for a moment, and it seemed to him as though faint and far-away music breathed up through the sapphire waters. He cursed impatiently, wondering if he were beginning to be bewitched, and flung aside all garments and ornaments except his girdle, loin-clout, and sword. He waded out into the shimmery blueness until it lapped his thighs. Then, knowing that the depths swiftly increased, he drew a deep breath and dived. As he swam down through the sapphire glimmer, he had time to reflect that this was probably a fool's errand. He might have taken time to find from Sairms just where Brule had been swimming when attacked, and whether he was destined to rescue the warrior or not. Still, he thought that the cat might not have told him, and even if she had assured him of failure, he would have attempted what he was now doing, anyway. So there was truth in Sairms saying that men were better untold than. As for the location of the lake battle, the monster might have dragged Brule anywhere. He intended to explore the lake bed until, even as he ruminated thus, a shadow flashed by him, a vague shimmer in the jade and sapphire shimmer of the lake. He was aware that other shadows swept by him on all sides, but he could not make out their form. Far beneath him he began to see the glimmer of the lake bottom, which seemed to glow with a strange radiance. Now the shadows were all about him. They wove a serpentine about and in front of him, an ever-changing thousand-hued glittering web of color. The water here burned topaz, and the things wavered and scintillated in its fairy splendor. Like the shades and shadows of colors, they were vague and unreal, yet opaque and gleaming. However, Kull, deciding that they had no intention of attacking him, gave them no more attention but directed his gaze on the lake floor, which his feet just then struck, lightly. He started, and could have sworn that he had landed on a living creature, for he felt a rhythmic movement beneath his bare feet. The faint glow was evident there at the bottom of the lake, as far as he could see, stretching away on all sides until it faded into the lambent sapphire shadows. The lake floor was one solid level of fire, that faded and glowed with unceasing regularity. Kull bent closer. The floor was covered by a sort of short moss-like substance which shone like white flame. It was as if the lake bed were covered with myriads of fireflies which raised and lowered their wings together. And this moss throbbed beneath his feet like a living thing. Now Kull began to swim upward again. Raised among the sea mountains of ocean-girt Atlantis, he was like a sea creature himself. As much at home in the water as any Lemurian, he could remain under the surface twice as long as the ordinary swimmer, but this lake was deep and he wished to conserve his strength. He came to the top, filled his enormous chest with air and dived again. Again the shadows swept about him, almost dazzling his eyes with their ghostly gleams. He swam faster this time, and having reached the bottom, he began to walk along it, as fast as the clinging substance about his limbs would allow, the while the fire moss breathed and glowed and the color things flashed about him and monstrous, nightmare shadows fell across his shoulder upon the burning floor, flung by unseen beings. The moss was littered by the skulls and the bones of men who had dared the forbidden lake, and suddenly, with a silent swirl of the waters, a thing rushed upon Kull. At first the king thought it to be a huge octopus, for the body was that of an octopus, with long waving tentacles, but as it charged upon him he saw it had legs like a man, and a hideous semi-human face leered at him from among the writhing snaky arms of the monster. Kull braced his feet, and as he felt the cruel tentacles whip about his limbs, he thrust his sword with cool accuracy into the midst of that demoniac face, and the creature lumbered down, and died at his feet with grisly soundless gibbering. Blood spread like a mist about him, and Kull thrust strongly against the floor with his legs and shot upward. He burst into the fast-fading light, and even as he did a great form came skimming across the water toward him, a water spider, but this one was larger than a horse, and its great cold eyes gleamed hellishly. Kull, keeping himself afloat with his feet and one hand, raised his sword, and as the spider rushed in, he cleft it halfway through the body and it sank silently. A slight noise made him turn, and another, larger than the first, was almost upon him. This one flung over the king's arms and shoulders great strands of clinging web that would have meant doom for any but a giant. But Kull burst the grim shackles as if they had been strings, and seizing a leg of the thing as it towered above him, he thrust the monster through again and again till it weakened in his grasp and floated away, reddening the blue waters.